Hello beautiful people. Welcome to The Fiction Wizard. In today's episode, we explore, what if Fawkes chose Harry at birth and burned away 73 tracking charms Dumbledore placed over 11 years? Hit like, subscribe, and join our community of story lovers. Let's begin. Chapter 1, Ember. The night James and Lily Potter died, it rained in Godric's Hollow. Not the dramatic, thunderous kind of rain that shows up in the stories people tell later, the kind that signals the end of something enormous. Just ordinary November rain, cold and sideways, the sort that gets under your collar and makes you wish you'd stayed inside. The kind of rain that doesn't care what's happening beneath it. Sirius Black was already on his motorbike somewhere over the Midlands, his face doing something it would never fully recover from. Peter Pettigrew was a rat in a drainpipe 3 counties away, his whiskers twitching. Albus Dumbledore was in his office at Hogwarts, standing very still at his desk with both hands flat on the surface, his eyes closed, feeling the precise moment the protection he'd helped construct shattered like glass dropped on stone. He reached for Fawkes without looking. His hand closed on empty air. The perch was bare. Dumbledore opened his eyes. He looked at the empty perch for a long moment, and then he did something he almost never did. He swore, quietly and specifically, in a language that hadn't been spoken aloud in 400 years. Fawkes had felt the child 3 days before he was born. Phoenixes don't experience time the way humans do. They experience it the way fire experiences a forest, all at once, from multiple points simultaneously, the future and the past both present in the current moment like heat haze shimmering off summer tarmac. So when Fawkes felt the child, he felt him not as an arriving thing but as an already existing thing, the way you feel the sun before you round the corner and see it. The feeling was, he didn't have words for it, because he didn't use words. It was like recognizing a song you've never heard before. It was like looking into a fire and seeing your own reflection looking back. He left Hogwarts on the 2nd of November, an hour before Voldemort arrived at the cottage in Godric's Hollow. He flew south and east with his wings folded against the rain, his body a streak of gold and red against a sky the color of iron, and he arrived at the cottage on Mold-on-the-Wold Road at 11:43 in the evening, 3 minutes before everything inside it went catastrophically wrong. He landed on the windowsill of an upstairs room and looked through the glass at a sleeping baby with a shock of black hair in his mother's eyes and a small, round face that was doing the thing all sleeping babies' faces do, that expression of perfect, unconscious certainty that the world is fundamentally safe. Fawkes watched the child. The child slept. Then, from downstairs, the front door exploded inward. What happened in the next 4 minutes inside that cottage is a matter of historical record in the wizarding world, retold so many times it had acquired the smooth, worn quality of legend by the time the boy at the center of it was old enough to hear it. Lily Potter died in the doorway of the nursery. The killing curse struck a 15-month-old child in the forehead and did something no killing curse had ever done before. What is not in any record, anywhere, is what happened at the window. The moment the curse struck Harry Potter, Fawkes screamed. It was not the musical, heartbreaking cry that phoenixes make in stories, the one that fills you with hope and courage. This was something older and rawer than that, the sound a phoenix makes when it burns, when the fire strips everything away and leaves only the essential, indestructible core of the thing. It blew out the windowpane. It cracked 2 roof tiles. Down on the street, a cat that was not actually a cat flinched and pressed itself against a garden wall. The rebound of Voldemort's curse was already happening, the ancient magic of a mother's sacrifice doing what it had always done, what it would always do. But as the Dark Lord's body dissolved and his spirit fled screaming into the night, and as baby Harry Potter lay in his cot with the lightning bolt scar blazing on his forehead, the window exploded inward and Fawkes was in the room. He landed on the edge of the cot. Harry Potter opened his eyes. They were very green, and they were completely awake, with the specific, disconcerting alertness of a child who has just been through something enormous and come out the other side of it. He looked at Fawkes. Fawkes looked at him. The bonding, when it happened, was not dramatic. There was no flash of light, no soaring music, no ritual or ceremony. Fawkes simply leaned forward and pressed his beak very gently to the lightning bolt scar on Harry's forehead, and Harry raised one small hand and wrapped his fingers around a single tail feather, and that was it. That was everything. What happened next was the part Dumbledore would have found interesting if he'd been there to see it. The phoenix fire is not destructive in the way ordinary fire is destructive. It doesn't burn randomly. It burns selectively. It strips away what doesn't belong, what has been added, what is foreign to the essential nature of the thing it touches. It's why phoenix tears heal. It's why a phoenix's song cuts through despair like a knife through silk. Despair is not native to the human spirit, and the fire knows it. Fawkes pressed his beak to Harry's scar and his fire ran through the bond, and it found things. 73 of them. They were woven so carefully, so expertly, so deep into the magical field of the child that anyone else would have missed them entirely. Monitoring charms, most of them, little watching spells that reported Harry's magical development, his emotional state, his location, his health, the quality of his dreams. Compulsion charms, subtle as suggestions, the ones that would make Harry more likely to trust certain authority figures, more likely to accept certain narratives about himself, more likely to feel a specific kind of anxious loyalty. Tracking charms that had been placed not on objects but on the magic itself, woven into the signature of his accidental displays so that every time Harry's power sparked, the information went somewhere specific. Some of them had been placed before his birth. Most had been placed after, in moments of contact, through objects handled and then given, through enchantments laid on locations Harry would inevitably pass through. The most recent one had been placed 3 months ago, and it was the finest work of the lot, a charm so light it was nearly transparent, designed to activate only when Harry first received his Hogwarts letter, to make the letters feel urgent and necessary and right. Fawkes's fire found all 73 of them and burned them to absolute nothing. It took approximately 40 seconds. Harry Potter watched the phoenix with eyes that were far too awake for a 15-month-old child, and Fawkes watched him back, and in that room in Godric's Hollow with rain coming through the broken window and Lily Potter lying in the doorway, something settled into place between them like a key turning in a lock. "Mine," said the fire. Not possessively. Protectively. The difference matters. Harry cooed softly and tightened his grip on the tail feather. 20 minutes later, Hagrid arrived to collect him. The problem with growing up knowing something is wrong with your life is that it makes you very, very hard to break. The Dursleys tried. Not consciously, not with malice aforethought, or at least, not with the kind of deliberate cruelty that can be named and prosecuted. They tried in the way people try to shape water, by creating containers they think will hold it, and being perpetually baffled when the water finds its own level regardless. Harry Potter grew up in a cupboard under the stairs. He wore Dudley's cast-offs and ate the leftover scraps and did the garden and the cooking and the cleaning. He was told his parents had died in a car crash, that he was strange and unwanted, that there was nothing special about him at all. And none of it took. Vernon Dursley understood violence in the abstract, the way people who've never been in a fight think they understand it, as a final resort, a hammer for the most stubborn nails. He raised it twice, in Harry's early years. Both times, something happened that stopped him cold. The first time, every light in the house blew out simultaneously and he found himself standing in total darkness, with the absolute, physical certainty that something in the dark was watching him. The second time, the temperature in the hallway dropped 20 degrees in under a second, and he heard a sound like very large wings. He never raised it a third time. Petunia didn't try to break Harry. She tried to ignore him, which is a different strategy and marginally more sophisticated. She was not entirely successful at this either, mostly because Harry had a quality that made him very difficult to ignore, not the quality of someone who demands attention, but the quality of someone who has already decided they don't need yours. It's more unnerving, in its way. Dudley tried bullying, because Dudley was 11 and bullying was his primary tool for navigating the world. It worked on other children. It did not work on Harry, who would look at Dudley during his finest moments of bluster with an expression of such calm, interested assessment that Dudley always ended up feeling that somehow he'd come off worse in an interaction that he'd started. He stopped after a while. It wasn't worth it. What none of them ever managed to do, what Dumbledore's compulsion charms might have done, if they'd survived contact with Phoenix fire, was make Harry feel small. He didn't walk through the world with a chip on his shoulder. He didn't simmer with resentment or scheme for revenge. He simply knew, with the deep and unshakable certainty of someone who has been touched by something ancient and true, that the Dursleys' opinion of him was not a fact about the universe. It was just an opinion. And not a particularly interesting one at that. He cooked their meals and did their garden and slept in his cupboard, and in the spaces between he read everything he could get his hands on from the school library and Petunia's bookshelf and the charity shop on the high street, and he thought about things, about the way the world worked and the way it should work and the difference between those two things. He had friends at school, not many, but real ones, a girl called Amara who could do mental arithmetic faster than anyone and a boy called Tomasz whose family had come from Poland 3 years ago and who taught Harry to swear in 2 languages. He was well liked by the teachers who were paying attention and invisible to the ones who weren't, which suited him perfectly. And sometimes, in the very early mornings, before the Dursleys woke and the house filled up with its particular brand of aggressive normalcy, he would sit on the back step and a bird would come. Not always the same bird, not always bird-shaped, exactly. More like fire that had decided to take the form of a bird because it was convenient. It would land near him and they would sit together in the quiet, and Harry would feel the same thing he'd felt every time, since the very beginning, since the very first night he could remember anything, seen. Completely, precisely, without judgment or agenda, seen. He never told anyone about the bird. Not because he was ashamed of it or frightened of it, but because it was his, and he had so few things that were only his. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in July, 3 weeks before his 11th birthday. Harry was making breakfast when he heard it hit the mat, not the particular sound of the regular post, which he knew well because he was the one who always retrieved it, but something different. Heavier. More intentional. He wiped his hands on the dish towel and went to the front door and found a letter on the mat, made of thick yellowish parchment, sealed with purple wax, addressed in emerald green ink to Mr. H. Potter, The Cupboard Under the Stairs, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. He picked it up and turned it over. Looked at the address for a moment. Looked at the seal on the back, which showed a badger, a lion, an eagle, and a snake surrounding the letter H. He said, to no one in particular. He took it to his cupboard and sat on his bed and opened it, and read it 3 times with the expression of someone confirming something they already suspected. Then he folded it neatly, put it back in its envelope, and put the envelope in his pillowcase. At dinner, Vernon Dursley said, anything in the post, with the very careful casualness of a man who'd seen the owl and was desperately hoping no one else had. Circular from the newsagent, Harry said. And a letter for me. The silence at the table took on a specific quality. What sort of letter? Petunia asked, without looking up from her plate. The Hogwarts sort, Harry said. He watched them. Vernon went red and then purple. Petunia went white. Dudley looked between them all with the baffled expression he wore whenever the adults in the room were communicating in a frequency he couldn't quite access. You knew, Harry said. It wasn't an accusation. He was just noting a fact. Your mother, Petunia started. Was a witch, yes, Harry said. And my father was a wizard. And they didn't die in a car crash. He picked up his fork and took a bite of his dinner with the composure of someone who had worked through most of his feelings about this over the last several years and arrived at something like equanimity. The school would like me to attend in September. I'd like to go. Vernon found his voice, or rather found the general area where his voice usually lived and excavated it. Absolutely not. No nephew of mine is going to some freak school for, the alternative, Harry said pleasantly, is that I stay here, with no outlet for whatever is happening when the lights go out and the temperature drops, and no formal instruction in how to manage it. He looked at his uncle with his very green eyes. "I don't think any of us want that." The silence stretched. "Fine," Vernon said, finally, in a tone that suggested the word cost him something. "Fine." "Thank you," Harry said, and went back to his dinner. He went to Diagon Alley on a Saturday, alone, because asking the Dursleys to accompany him was not a conversation he wanted to have, and he had always been good at finding his way around London. He had money, not much, but enough, because at age 8 he'd asked Petunia directly and with some firmness where his parents' things were, and Petunia, confronted with a child who looked at her the way Harry looked at people, had gone to the attic and come back with a small key on a chain and the information that it opened a vault in a bank called Gringotts. Harry had worn the key around his neck for 3 years. He found the entrance easily enough. The leaky cauldron was not as invisible to him as it apparently was to most muggles, which he filed away as interesting, and he stepped into the dim, smoky interior and stopped. The pub was full of witches and wizards, and the moment he stepped through the door, heads turned. He felt it like a tide, the sudden, concentrated attention of a roomful of people all recognizing the same thing at the same time. The lightning bolt scar was visible above his fringe, and he'd worn his hair back enough that he hadn't thought to hide it, and now he stood in the doorway of the leaky cauldron while everyone stared at him. He stared back, with calm, unself-conscious curiosity. A man at the bar, middle-aged, jovial, with a dramatic mustache, slid off his stool and came toward him with his hand extended. "Harry Potter." "Tom, look, it's Harry Potter." The barkeep, old and hairless as a walnut, craned over the bar. "Yes," Harry agreed, shaking the man's hand. "Are you able to tell me the way through to Diagon Alley?" "I haven't been before." The man blinked, visibly recalibrating. He'd expected something different, Harry supposed, awe, perhaps, or confusion, or the particular hunted look of someone overwhelmed by attention. He shook the man's hand, smiled politely at the barkeep, extracted himself from 3 more attempted conversations with the smooth competence of someone who'd been navigating unwanted social dynamics since age 5, and found the rear courtyard and the brick wall with the arch that led through to Diagon Alley. He stood for a moment looking at the street that opened out before him, the shops, the people in robes, the street vendors and the owls and the whole impossible, marvelous reality of it, and he breathed it in. "Right," he said quietly, to himself. And then, softer, to the fire that was always somewhere at the edge of his awareness, "You knew about this." The warmth that came back was not apologetic, exactly. More like, "Of course." He spent the morning working through his list efficiently. Gringotts first, where the goblins gave him exactly the cool, transactional respect he felt most comfortable with, and where he withdrew enough gold and made a careful note of his vault's contents, which were considerably more substantial than he'd expected. His parents had been well off, and whatever had happened to their estate had been managed by the goblins in the interim, and managing was something goblins were quite good at. Madame Malkin's for robes. Flourish and blots for books, where he spent much longer than planned because the magical theory section was more extensive than he'd hoped and he had to make himself put down 4 volumes that weren't on his required list but which were clearly essential. Potions ingredients. A telescope. A set of scales. He saved Ollivanders for last. The wand shop was narrow and quiet and full of that particular quality of attention that old things in old buildings have, the feeling that the building itself is watching you, has always been watching, has watched a great many people come and go. Harry stepped through the door into the dusty, tower-high interior and waited. Ollivander appeared from between the shelves like a thought you weren't expecting. He was silver-haired and pale, with eyes that caught what little light there was and held it longer than seemed natural. "I wondered," he said, looking at Harry with those reflective eyes, "when I might be seeing you." "Harry Potter." He said the name the way you'd say the name of a theorem you'd been trying to prove for years and had finally, late at night, cracked. "Mr. Ollivander," Harry said. "Your father, James Potter, purchased a wand from me. Mahogany, 11 inches, pliable, excellent for transfiguration. Your mother, Lily Potter, 10 1/4, willow, swishy, rather good for charms work. He had come very close, and he was looking at Harry's forehead. Then he stopped. "Interesting," he said. "What is?" "Your magical signature." He tilted his head. I've sold wands to a great many people, Mr. Potter. I've felt a great many signatures. Yours is," he paused. "Clean. That's not quite the word. Clear. As if someone took something complicated and burned it down to the essential element." He looked at Harry directly. "Has anything significant happened to you, magically? Something unusual?" Harry thought about this. About the bird that came to sit with him on the back step, the fire that wasn't always fire, the thing that had been with him as long as he could remember. "Once," he said. "A long time ago, I think." Ollivander held his gaze for a moment, and then he went to his shelves. He came back with a tape measure that measured everything, including several things Harry was fairly sure tape measures didn't normally measure. Then he began bringing wands. It was, in his own words, highly unusual. Wands that would have worked for most young witches and wizards came away vibrating or ice-cold. One produced a small contained fire at the tip that burned blue and had to be extinguished. Another made the tower of boxes at the back of the shop reorganize itself into a different configuration before Harry had even finished the motion. Ollivander kept coming back with more. He was not frustrated, he was fascinated, in the way of a very good craftsman encountering a problem that challenges the actual limits of his craft. "Tell me," he said, after the 19th unsuccessful wand, "is there something you're not telling me?" "Probably," Harry said honestly. "But I don't know what it is." Ollivander looked at him for a long moment. Then he went to the very back of the shop, to a shelf that was lower than the others and set apart, and he came back with a box that was different from the rest, older, darker, slightly dusty. "I made this one 23 years ago," he said. "I've never been able to sell it. The core is unusual." He opened the box. Inside, on a bed of dark velvet, lay a wand of holly, pale, almost white, with a subtle grain that caught the light like water. Holly, 11 inches, with a phoenix feather core. I obtained the feather from a phoenix that had never submitted to any bonding. Wild, essentially. The feather itself has opinions. Harry reached for it. The moment his fingers closed around the handle, the wand didn't produce sparks or a shower of lights or any of the dramatic effects that the others had attempted. What it produced was warmth. Not heat, warmth. The specific, particular warmth of a fireplace in winter, of something that has always been burning and will keep burning long after everything else has gone cold. The boxes at the back of the shop didn't move. The lights didn't flare. Ollivander just stood very still and looked at Harry holding the wand, and his expression was the expression of a man watching something click into place that he'd been almost certain would never click. "Well," he said quietly. "That's the one." Harry lowered the wand and looked at it. "The phoenix the feather came from," he said. "You said wild." "Yes." Did it have, he thought about how to phrase this. Gold and red coloring? Very bright? The eyes more orange than yellow? Ollivander was very still. "Mr. Potter," he said, slowly and carefully. "Where did you encounter a phoenix of that description?" Harry tucked the wand into his pocket and met the old wandmaker's eyes. "It visits me," he said. "Has done, as long as I can remember. I didn't know what it was until this morning, actually. I looked it up in Flourish and Blots." Silence in the wand shop. Outside, the sounds of Diagon Alley continued normally, the shouts of vendors, the rumble of cart wheels, the cheerful, crowded noise of a world going about its business. In here, it was absolutely quiet. "A wild phoenix bond," Ollivander said. He said it the way you'd say a living dinosaur or time running backwards. Not domesticated. Not inherited. A wild bond, formed freely. He sat down on his stool, slowly, as if his legs had decided to revisit their professional commitment. I have read about such a thing. Once. In a volume I was not supposed to have access to, at a library that no longer exists. He looked at Harry. Do you understand what that means? What you are, with that bond in place? I'm beginning to, Harry said. He paid 7 galleons and left. Behind him, Ollivander sat on his stool for a long time and thought about a great many things. He told no one about the Phoenix. Not on the train to Hogwarts, which he boarded on his own, found his way to with the confidence of someone who'd navigated London solo since age 9, and not in the carriage across the lake, which he shared with 3 other first years who introduced themselves as Hermione Granger, Ron Weasley, and Neville Longbottom. Hermione he clocked immediately as the kind of mind that comes along once a generation and spends the first half of its life being mishandled by institutions not designed for it. She launched into a detailed recitation of everything she'd memorized from Hogwarts, a history approximately 90 seconds after sitting down, which most people found intimidating or tiresome. Harry found it delightful. He asked 3 follow-up questions that surprised her visibly, and they spent the rest of the lake crossing arguing about whether Hogwarts enchantments were more accurately classified as permanent charms or self-maintaining transfiguration, which was an argument that had no stakes and no resolution and was therefore exactly the right argument to be having on a boat in the dark heading toward a castle for the first time. Ron watched this with the expression of someone watching a tennis match at twice normal speed. He was tall for his age, freckled, with a gap between his front teeth and very blue eyes, and when Hermione finally paused for breath he said to Harry, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Harry asked. "Dunno. Something a bit more," he waved a hand. "Impressive?" "Weird," Ron said honestly. "My brothers told me you glowed during the sorting when they were first years." Said the whole hall lit up. "I haven't been sorted yet," Harry pointed out. "Yeah." Ron squinted at him. "But you're going to, aren't you? And something's going to happen." "Something usually does," Harry said, and Ron grinned, and that was more or less the beginning of the most important friendship of either of their lives. Neville had been quiet through all of this, sitting in the corner of the boat with his toad, Trevor, who had made 2 escape attempts already, and saying very little. But he watched Harry with a different quality of attention than the others, something careful and assessing. Just before they reached the shore, he said, quietly, "My parents were in the Order of the Phoenix." "Before?" He paused. "Before what happened to them?" "The boat scraped stone." Harry looked at Neville. "I know," he said. "Not about your parents, I didn't know that. But I know about before." He held Neville's gaze. "I'm sorry about your parents." Neville looked at him for a moment, and then he nodded, once, and stepped out of the boat, and that was a different kind of beginning. The castle hit him the way it hits everyone, in the chest, in the back of the throat, with the combination of recognition and disorientation that means your brain is trying to process something that's too large for the category it's trying to put it in. Harry stopped on the steps for a half-second, looking up at the towers against the night sky, and felt the magic of the place like a physical thing, old and dense and layered, centuries of cast spells soaked into the stone. He also, in that half-second, felt something else. Watching. Not in the way Fawkes watched, not with warmth or recognition. This was assessment. Cold, careful, calibrated. He'd felt something like it before, in dreams he didn't quite remember in the mornings, the sensation of being observed, of information being collected about him. It had always been faint and distant, and he'd never been able to identify its source. Now, here, stepping into Hogwarts, it flared and then, as if it had just become aware of itself, snapped off. He stood very still on the steps for exactly 1 second. Then he filed it away, deep, in the part of his mind he used for things that needed to be thought about later, and he followed the crowd inside. The Great Hall was everything it was supposed to be, candles and the enchanted ceiling and 4 long tables full of older students craning their necks to see the first years file in. Harry walked behind Hermione and in front of Neville and he didn't look at the ceiling or the floating candles. He looked at the staff table. He found what he was looking for immediately. The man in the center of the staff table was ancient in the way that certain things are ancient, not decrepit, but deep-rooted, like a tree that's been there so long it's become part of the landscape. Long silver hair and beard, half-moon spectacles, blue eyes that were famous for their expression of twinkling, avuncular wisdom. He was looking at the first years with a specific quality of attention, scanning. Looking for something. Harry kept his face neutral. He continued walking. When the headmaster's gaze reached him, it stopped. The eyes behind the half-moon spectacles sharpened. Whatever Dumbledore had been expecting to find when he looked at Harry Potter, whatever portrait he'd built in his mind over 11 years of careful monitoring, the boy standing in the Great Hall of Hogwarts didn't match it. The eyes were wrong. Not the color, green, exactly right, his mother's eyes, but the quality of them. There was no anxiety there, no awe, no desperate reaching for belonging. Just clear, direct attention. The gaze of someone who has already decided who they are and finds most attempts to define them from the outside vaguely interesting at best. Dumbledore held Harry's gaze for a fraction of a second. Harry held it back without blinking. A very slight shift in the old wizard's expression, too small for anyone else to read, and too large for Harry to miss, surprise. Genuine, unperformed surprise, from a man who was very rarely surprised. Harry looked away first, but only because Professor McGonagall had begun calling names. He stood and waited while the other students sat down one by one, Hermione to Gryffindor, where she sat with her back very straight and her face bright with satisfaction, Neville, after a long pause by the hat that made him look increasingly mortified, also to Gryffindor, to his visible relief, Ron to Gryffindor, immediately and loudly. Then McGonagall said, "Potter, Harry," and the hall made the sound that rooms full of people make when everyone breathes in at the same time. Harry walked to the stool. Sat down. Settled the hat on his head. The hat was very old, and it had sorted a great many children, and it encountered very few things it couldn't immediately categorize. It touched Harry Potter's mind and, for the first time in its 400-year operational history, stopped completely. "Oh," said the hat. Not aloud. In his mind. In the voice of something that has seen a great deal and is only occasionally still surprised by what it sees. "Well. That's different." "Hello," Harry thought back. "You're aware of this process." "I read about it. Hogwarts, a history, and a couple of others." The hat was quiet for a moment. When it spoke again it was with a different quality, slower, more careful, the way you'd speak to someone you'd misjudged at first glance and were now recalibrating for. Most children, at this point, are hoping very hard. Afraid. Excited. Wanting. "I know where I belong," Harry said. "I'm just waiting for you to catch up." Another pause. Longer. The hat was looking, that was the only word for it, looking, at something in Harry's mind that most hats don't find in 11-year-olds. Not mature, exactly. Not precociousness. Something more fundamental. The specific shape of a mind that knows itself. "There's a mark here," the hat said quietly. "Something burned away, long ago. I can see the shape of it but not the substance." "Yes," Harry said. "And something else. Something present, not absent. Older than you are. Older than I am, possibly. A beat. A bond." "Yes," Harry said again. The hat was quiet for a very long time. The hall had gone from anticipatory silence to something more charged, students leaning forward, whispers starting and stopping. McGonagall stood with her scroll, her expression precisely neutral. At the staff table, Dumbledore had gone very still. Then the hat said, in Harry's mind, with something that might have been the closest a hat can come to respect, "I could sort you anywhere, you know. You'd flourish. Any house. But you already know that, don't you?" "Yes," Harry said, for the third time. Then this isn't really about you finding where you belong. It's about you choosing. I suppose it is. Gryffindor. The word rang out across the great hall and the Gryffindor table erupted, and Harry lifted the hat from his head and handed it back to McGonagall with a nod, and walked to the table to sit between Neville and Ron. He didn't look at the staff table. He could feel Dumbledore looking at him. He reached for a bread roll and started eating, and Ron immediately started telling him about his brothers and their predictions for this year's Quidditch season, and Neville was looking at his plate with the particular smile of someone who just cleared a hurdle they'd been afraid of, and it was all very ordinary and very loud and very warm. Under the table, out of sight, a tiny flame appeared at the tip of Harry's index finger. Not panic. Not display. Just, the way Fawkes would sometimes brush against his shoulder to say I'm here. Harry closed his fingers around the flame and felt it warm his whole hand. I know, he thought. Me too. The candles overhead blazed a little brighter for a moment. Nobody noticed except Dumbledore, who noticed everything, and who sat at the center of the staff table looking at the back of Harry Potter's head with the expression of a chess grandmaster who has just realized that one of the pieces on the board has been playing its own game since the very beginning. He reached for his goblet and drank slowly and thought about fire. Chapter 2, The Sorting of Things. The morning after the sorting, Hogwarts smelled like old stone and frying bacon and the particular kind of possibility that only exists at the very beginning of something. Harry woke early, before the other boys in the first-year dormitory had stirred. He lay on his back for a moment, looking at the canopy above him, deep red, heavy fabric, the kind of thing that under other circumstances might have felt oppressively grand, and he listened to the castle. It was doing what old buildings do in the early morning, settling and creaking softly, and underneath that sound was something else, something that wasn't quite a sound but that he'd always been able to hear. The low, continuous hum of old magic working, the way a power station hums if you stand close enough. He dressed quietly, picked up his wand from the nightstand, and went downstairs. The common room was empty except for a portrait of a fat knight who snored with extraordinary dedication. Harry crossed to the window and stood looking out at the grounds. The lake was iron-gray in the early light, perfectly flat, and the forbidden forest at the edge of the grounds was a dark smear against the sky. From somewhere above him, a tower. From somewhere very far away, the sense he'd carried since yesterday of being watched, not warmly, not openly, but carefully. The observation had a shape now. He was beginning to understand its architecture. He pushed it aside for later and went back upstairs to wait for breakfast. Ron Weasley woke up announcing that he was starving, which Harry was rapidly identifying as one of Ron's primary modes of entering a room. The other boys, Seamus Finnegan, Dean Thomas, and Neville, stirred in various stages of morning competence, and they went down to breakfast in a loose, companionable group that already had the comfortable feeling of a habit forming. The great hall was filling up. Hermione was already at the Gryffindor table with a copy of the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1 open next to her porridge. She looked up when Harry sat down and said, without preamble, I've been thinking about what you said last night. About the enchantments. I think you're wrong. About which part? Harry asked, pouring pumpkin juice. The classification. Permanent charms require renewal by a practitioner, even if the interval is centuries rather than years. The enchantments on Hogwarts haven't been renewed by a practitioner since the founders, Harry said. Which means they're either a form of self-maintaining transfiguration or they're something we don't have a good category for. There's a third option, Hermione said, with the expression of someone producing a trump card. They could be anchored to the magical core of the building itself, drawing power from the stone and the wards rather than from external renewal. In which case the classification question is moot because they're not conventional charms at all. Harry looked at her. Where did you read that? I didn't. I worked it out. Ron looked up from a mountainous plate of eggs. Is this what you two are going to be like? Because I want to be prepared. Yes, Harry and Hermione said simultaneously, and then looked at each other with the mutual recognition of two people who have unexpectedly found a thinking partner. Post arrived with the usual thunderclap of owls. Harry watched a barn owl drop a package at Neville's elbow that turned out to be a remembrall from his grandmother, which glowed red the moment Neville touched it and made him look immediately anxious. An eagle owl Harry recognized as expensive landed near Draco Malfoy at the Slytherin table and deposited a parcel with an air of having done something important. A few rows down, Fred and George Weasley were already deeply involved in something they were pretending wasn't a scheme. Harry got no post, which was fine. He hadn't expected any. What he did get, in lieu of post, was the continued, careful attention of the headmaster's table, which he could feel the way you feel a draft under a door, constant, specific, coming from one direction. He turned and looked directly at the staff table. Dumbledore was looking at him. The old wizard didn't look away, he offered a small nod, pleasant and measured, the nod of someone who is in control of this interaction and is letting you know it. Harry nodded back, equally pleasant, and went back to his breakfast. Ron had been watching this exchange. "You know," he said, very carefully, "most first years are afraid of him." "Are you?" Harry asked. "I'm a Weasley," Ron said, as if this answered the question. "Dad works at the Ministry. Dumbledore's everywhere. He's Dumbledore. You don't really think about being afraid of him, same way you don't think about being afraid of the weather." "That," Harry said thoughtfully, "is an interesting way to put it." First lesson was Transfiguration, and McGonagall wasted no time establishing that she was not a person who tolerated theatrics. She walked in, transformed her desk into a pig and back again in the same unhurried motion, and looked at them all with an expression that dared them to be unimpressed. Harry was impressed. Genuinely, not performatively. The motion had been economical, almost casual, the kind of effortlessness that only comes from absolute mastery, when the skill has been so thoroughly internalized it's indistinguishable from instinct. Transfiguration, McGonagall said, setting a matchstick in front of each student, is the most complex and precise branch of magic you will study at Hogwarts. Failure to focus will mean mistakes. Mistakes in Transfiguration can be, she paused in a way that communicated that the word she was reaching for was catastrophic, significant. You will not be attempting anything other than the conversion of a matchstick into a needle today, and most of you will not achieve even that. This is not a judgment of your potential. It is a statement about where the skill level required for Transfiguration sits relative to where you currently are. She looked at them all with that steady, assessing gaze. "That said, one or two of you may surprise me. I am difficult to surprise. Mr. Finnegan, please stop trying to levitate the matchstick. That is a different class." Harry looked at the matchstick on the table in front of him. He turned it over once with his finger, feeling its weight, its texture, the specific density of wood. He thought about what it was at the molecular level, or as close to that concept as wizarding theory got, the grain of the wood, the way light caught the white tip. Then he thought about what he wanted it to be, not just the visual image of a needle but the fact of it, the weight, the fineness, the particular cold gleam of steel. He set his wand against it and thought, quite simply, change. The matchstick became a needle. Not a middling, half-transformed needle, not the kind with the wooden tip still showing, or the kind that was needle-shaped but wrong-colored. A perfect needle, silver, with an eye and a sharp point and a weight that was absolutely right. He picked it up and set it carefully on the edge of the table. McGonagall, who had been moving between desks, stopped. She came to his table and picked up the needle and looked at it. She put it down. She looked at Harry. Harry looked back. "How many times have you attempted Transfiguration before?" she asked. "Never in a classroom," Harry said. "Have you practiced from a book?" "I read the theory. I hadn't tried it practically." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Potter, 5 points to Gryffindor," in a tone that was almost entirely controlled and only slightly, around the edges, suggested that she was recalibrating something significant. She moved on to the next student, whose matchstick had developed an unusual texture but retained its general shape. Ron turned from the desk beside him and stared at Harry's needle. You just, first try. The theory's good, Harry said. If you understand what you're asking the magic to do, the doing part is mostly about getting out of your own way. Ron picked up his matchstick, frowned at it with tremendous concentration, and produced something that was metal and sharp but more closely resembled a very small sword. He looked at it with mixed feelings. Better than yesterday, Harry offered. I haven't had a yesterday yet, Ron said. This is literally my first attempt. Then better than most people's firsts, Harry said, and Ron looked slightly mollified. Hermione, 2 rows over, had a perfect needle by the 15-minute mark. She caught Harry's eye across the room and raised both eyebrows, the silent communication of 2 people comparing notes, and Harry gave her a small nod that said, yes, it's as interesting as the book made it sound. Neville's matchstick had turned a different color. This was progress. Neville was treating it with exactly the same concentrated, slightly anxious expression he'd been wearing since Trevor's second escape attempt on the boats, and Harry made a note to look into that, not the toad, but the expression. The anxiety. The way Neville approached magic, the way someone approaches a surface they've been told not to touch. After class, walking in a loose group toward the ground floor for their next lesson, Harry fell into step beside Neville. Your grandmother. Is she strict about grades? Neville's face did something complicated. She's strict about everything. What did she do when you got the remembrall? She was pleased. She sent it because I keep forgetting things. Harry looked at him. You remember everything from the boat last night. You remembered that my parents were in the order. I'd bet you remember most things that actually matter to you. Neville blinked. Yes, but, so the remembrals for things that don't matter enough to remember naturally, Harry said. Which means your grandmother is confusing memory about important things with memory in general, and using a device designed for the former to make you feel inadequate about the latter. He paused. That's about her, not you. Neville walked in silence for a moment. That's, when you put it that way, think about what you do remember, Harry said. And stop treating the remembrall as evidence of anything except that your grandmother worries. He moved on ahead, and Neville watched him go with the expression of someone who has just had a window opened in a room they'd been breathing stale air in. Charms with Flitwick was enthusiastic and orderly and exactly what Harry had expected from the reading. Astronomy was fascinating. History of magic was an exercise in the specific torture of being lectured at by a ghost who had clearly been bored by the material for over 100 years, and Harry spent the period taking notes from the textbook instead of from Professor Binns, which produced the same information in a fraction of the time. Potions was last on Thursday, and if Transfiguration had been a quiet surprise, Potions was something more operatic. Professor Snape came into the dungeon the way weather comes into a room, changing the atmosphere, making you very aware of temperature and pressure. He was tall and dark-robed, and he moved like he'd been constructed specifically to occupy uncomfortable silences, and the moment he walked in, half the class sat up straighter purely on instinct. Harry watched him with the same calm attention he gave everything. Snape surveyed the room with eyes that were dark and flat as a winter lake. Then, slowly and deliberately, those eyes moved to Harry Potter, and they stopped. Something went through Snape's face in a very short space of time, a sequence of things that most people would have missed entirely. Recognition, of course. But recognition wasn't the whole of it. There was something else, something more complicated, that resolved finally into the particular expression of a man who has prepared extensively for a specific type of person and has discovered he's prepared for the wrong one. Potter, he said. Professor, Harry said. The title landed precisely, and Snape blinked, a very small blink, barely perceptible. Harry had addressed him the way you'd address someone who has earned something, not the way first years usually addressed authority, which was with either fear or the specific, poorly calculated bravado of people trying to disguise fear. Snape began the register. When he reached Harry's name and the class leaned forward with collective anticipation, waiting for the famous speech, "Ah, yes, Mr. Potter, our new celebrity," and the speech didn't come, just the mark in the register and a brief, unreadable pause. The collective energy in the room changed slightly. Ron, beside Harry, looked vaguely disappointed. He'd clearly been briefed by his brothers. Instead, Snape moved directly into what turned out to be one of the better opening lectures Harry had encountered so far. He spoke about potions the way someone speaks about something they actually care about, underneath all the theater, the chemistry of it, the precision required, the difference between following a recipe and understanding the system that the recipe represents. The difference, Snape said, moving between the benches, between a competent potioneer and an exceptional one is not intelligence. Intelligence is common enough. It is the willingness to understand why this ingredient at this temperature, why this sequence, what the chain of cause and effect is that the recipe is a notational shorthand for. He stopped at the front. Recipes are for people who don't want to understand. Those of you who want to merely pass your OWLS will do fine learning recipes. Those of you who want to know what you're actually doing will look at the recipe and ask what it means. He turned and his eyes swept the room, and landed, briefly, on Harry. Harry was writing down verbatim what Snape had just said, not because he needed the notes but because the articulation was genuinely useful. He didn't look up. After a moment, Snape moved on. The practical component was a simple potion, a calming draft, basic ingredients, no complex timing. Harry worked through it the way he'd worked through the Transfiguration, with attention to what he was actually doing rather than to the performance of doing it. He read the recipe twice, identified the 3 moments where the instructions were notation for something more complex, and adjusted accordingly. When he'd finished, his potion was the clear pale blue it was supposed to be. Snape came to his bench and looked at the potion. He looked at it for quite a long time. The consistency is correct, he said, which was clearly not the opening he'd planned on, and then, as if he couldn't quite help himself, you modified the 3rd step. The recipe says to stir clockwise 7 times, Harry said. But the reason you're stirring clockwise is to align the cellular structure of the knotgrass. If the knotgrass is particularly young, which this batch is, you can tell by the color, the structure aligns faster and 7 clockwise stirs would over-align it. So 5. Silence at the bench. Where, Snape said, very carefully, did you read that? I worked it out from the ingredient properties in the textbook, Harry said. Chapter 4, the section on knotgrass, and Chapter 7 on stirring mechanics. Ron, who had been trying to subtly watch this exchange from 3 feet away while also monitoring his own potion, made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cough. Snape's gaze moved to him with the precision of a targeting system. Something to contribute, Mr. Weasley? No, sir, Ron said, with the expression of someone having a conversation only with their own potion. Snape looked back at Harry's calming draft. He said nothing more, which was itself a kind of evaluation, and moved on. But as he passed the bench, and as Harry turned back to the cooling potion, something flickered at the edge of his peripheral vision, the subtlest shift in Snape's expression, there and gone in half a second. Frustration, Harry thought. But not the frustrated contempt he'd been prepared for. The frustration of a man recalculating. Good, Harry thought, and cleaned his equipment. He found the library the first Friday evening, which he'd identified from the map he'd memorized before arriving as the most efficient use of his first free period. He was walking the route from Gryffindor Tower when he felt the watching sensation again, stronger this time. Not directional, it was coming from the castle itself, almost, from the walls. He stopped in the middle of a corridor on the 3rd floor and turned slowly. There was a door. He hadn't noticed it because it was set flush with the wall, without a visible handle, the kind of door that announces its own unimportance. What he noticed was that there was something behind it, magical, dense, the kind of concentrated enchantment that meant the room was warded heavily, and the wards were recent. Recent within the year. Interesting. He filed that away too, and continued to the library. He was at a table with 3 books open, Intermediate Magical Theory, a volume on Phoenix lore he'd found in the restricted adjacent section, and the charms textbook, when Hermione appeared at his table with her own stack of books and sat down without asking. He looked up. She looked at him over her stack with the expression of someone who has decided that asking permission in this situation is a formality that doesn't serve either party. "The Phoenix book," she said quietly, looking at the spine. "Yes. That's not on any of our reading lists." "No." She looked at him for a moment. Then, with the decisiveness that he was coming to recognize as one of her core qualities, she reached into her bag and pulled out a copy of the same book. She'd clearly had it for several days. It was already annotated. Harry looked at her annotated copy and then at his own, which was not annotated because he was reading it for the first time right now. "When did you get that?" "The day after I got my Hogwarts letter," she said. "I read everything I could find about magical creatures, and when I got to the Phoenix section I found 3 separate references that suggested wild Phoenix bonds hadn't been recorded since the 15th century. She paused. "And then I came to Hogwarts and I met you." Another pause. "And last night at dinner when you reached for the bread there was a small flame on your fingertip for about 3 seconds that you closed your hand around." Harry looked at her. "I'm not going to tell anyone," she said immediately. "That's not, I'm telling you because you should know that it was visible if someone was paying attention, and you should probably be more careful, and also because if we're going to be friends I'd rather know what I'm actually working with." "Are we going to be friends?" Harry said. "Obviously," Hermione said, with a matter-of-factness that made the word land more warmly than any elaborate declaration could have. She opened her Phoenix book. "Now. There's a section on page 83 about the transfer of perception in wild bonds that I have 3 questions about. Sunday was the first flying lesson. Or rather, Sunday was when the flying lessons were scheduled. What actually happened was somewhat different from what the instructions specified. Madame Hooch lined them all up with brooms on the grass and explained the summoning command, and Harry's broom shot into his hand on the first syllable, which startled Madame Hooch less than it would have startled most teachers because she'd been watching Harry's broom since the moment he'd crossed onto the pitch and it had been straining upward against the grass since he arrived, like a dog at a leash. Draco Malfoy was watching this from 2 brooms down. He'd been watching Harry with increasing attention since the sorting, with the specific focus of someone who had received a briefing about a situation that has not matched the briefing. Malfoy was not stupid. Harry had registered this early and continued to register it. He'd been raised to be politically aware in the way purebloods from old families often were, and he was capable of revising his assessments when reality demanded it. The difficulty was that revising required acknowledging the original assessment was wrong, which sat uneasily with his self-image. He had been trying to befriend Harry since the first breakfast. Not in an obvious way, he was too carefully raised for obvious. But the attempts had been there, the casual comments positioning himself as the right sort of connection to have, the pointed remarks about blood status clearly designed to position Harry in one camp versus another, the extended hand in the corridor that second morning that Harry had shaken with perfect cordiality and then walked away from without the expected follow-up conversation. Now Neville, 2 places to Harry's left, fumbled the summoning command and his broom shot up and caught him in the face, and Malfoy laughed, and Harry looked at him. "Don't," Harry said. Malfoy blinked. "I'm sorry." "Don't," Harry repeated, in a tone that was not angry and not aggressive and not anything except precisely direct. "It's not interesting. You're doing it to establish a hierarchy that only matters to you. Neville's learning the same thing you are. Try the summoning command again." Complete silence on the pitch. Madame Hooch, who had been moving toward Neville, had stopped. Everyone had stopped. Malfoy's face was doing several things at once, none of them comfortable. The calculation Harry could see working behind his eyes was the right kind of calculation, not how do I punish this but how do I process this, and Harry gave him credit for it. "Potter," Malfoy started. "I'm not interested in being positioned," Harry said simply. "If you want to talk, talk. If you want to fly, let's fly." He turned back to his broom. "Madame Hooch? Can we get off the ground?" Madame Hooch looked at him with an expression that he suspected she'd been unable to show since sometime in her 3rd year of teaching, when all of it had become either predictable or bureaucratic. She looked as if someone had opened a window she'd forgotten was there. "Mr. Potter," she said, "you may go up." He went up. Flying was not a surprise, exactly. There are some things you know you'll love before you try them, the way you know you'll like a piece of music from the first 3 notes. But the reality of it was more than he'd expected. The broom under him was responsive in a way that felt more like extension than vehicle. It moved when he thought, adjusted before he shifted, banked and turned with a sensitivity that surprised him. The ground fell away below and the castle grew large and then larger against the grey autumn sky, and he pushed the broom forward and felt the speed hit him like cold water, immediate and clarifying. He flew for 40 minutes while Madame Hooch took the others through basics below, and he didn't do anything dramatic, no dives, no inversions, just flew, learning the broom the way you learn a new instrument. Feeling where the limitations were. Testing the edges. When he brought the broom down, Ron was waiting at the edge of the pitch with his eyes wide. "Okay," Ron said. "Can I be on your Quidditch team? I haven't been offered a Quidditch spot." "You will be," Ron said, with the certainty of someone who's been around the sport long enough to recognize what he'd just watched. "Trust me. You'll be on the team by tomorrow." He was on the team by tomorrow. McGonagall came to find him in the corridor between Charms and History of Magic with a Nimbus 2000 under her arm and told him he was to be Gryffindor's new Seeker, youngest in a century, and then she looked at him as if expecting awe. He thanked her with genuine warmth. He wanted to play, it sounded brilliant, and when she'd gone Ron said, "You know, she expected you to be more impressed." "I was impressed," Harry said. "You looked like someone had told you the post was early." "I'm not very good at looking impressed," Harry said honestly. "I'm working on it." The first staff meeting of the term was the Monday after the flying lesson, and Dumbledore sat at the head of the table in the small meeting room off the 2nd floor and looked at each of his staff members in turn and thought about what he'd spent the weekend thinking about. The 73 charms were gone. He'd confirmed this the morning after the sorting, with the specific, unobtrusive diagnostic he'd developed over years of practice, a charm laid over a charm, the way you check a lock by trying the door rather than examining the mechanism. He'd expected resistance, degradation, perhaps interference from the castle's own enchantments. What he'd found was absence. Clean, total absence, with the specific signature, he'd nearly sat down when he'd identified it, of Phoenix Fire. Not any Phoenix Fire. He'd been around Fawkes for 40 years, and he knew the character of that fire the way you know the handwriting of someone you've worked alongside. This was Fawkes's fire, absolutely. But it was Fawkes's fire as it had never been in 40 years of Dumbledore's acquaintance with it, unmediated, uncontrolled, wild. The fire of a phoenix acting purely on its own nature and its own choice. Fawkes had been back on his perch at Hogwarts every day since. He'd sat there and burned, gold and red and steady, and whenever Dumbledore looked at him he looked back with his bright, ancient eyes, and said nothing, because phoenixes don't speak. But the message was extremely clear. Severus was looking at him from the left side of the table with the expression he wore when he had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. Minerva was reading the agenda with the focused attention she brought to everything administrative. Quirinus Quirrell was at the end of the table, looking at his hands, and Dumbledore allowed his eyes to rest on Quirrell for a moment with the patience of someone waiting for a process to complete. That situation had its own timeline. Separate matter. "The first years," he said, opening the meeting, "are settling in well. I have heard particularly interesting things about several students." He let that land without pointing it at anyone. "I would like, this year, for us to pay particular attention to student development in the first-year cohort. There are some exceptional young people in that group and I want to be sure we're giving them what they need." Minerva looked up from the agenda with an expression that was, in its own way, very informative. She had been teaching for 30 years and she had a mind like a very fine instrument. She said, "There are indeed," and went back to the agenda, and didn't add anything, and the not adding was itself a statement. Severus said nothing. His face was a closed door, which meant he was thinking very hard about something and had no intention of sharing it. After the meeting, Dumbledore walked alone back to his office. Fawkes was on the perch. Dumbledore stood in front of him and they looked at each other in the firelight. 73, Dumbledore said quietly. It was not quite an accusation. He was too honest with himself for that. I suppose you thought they were too many. Fawkes tilted his head and made a sound that was not quite music and not quite speech, a sound that sat somewhere in between and communicated something clear: not too many. Wrong. Dumbledore was quiet for a long time. He sat down at his desk and looked at his hands, long-fingered, marked by decades of magic, holding the weight of decisions he'd made and continued to stand behind, because the alternative was to admit that certainty, wielded long enough, becomes something you can no longer distinguish from control. He did not admit this yet. But it moved closer to the surface, like something coming up for air. Halloween arrived with the smell of pumpkins and the particular energy of a school full of children who were given a legitimate excuse to be excited about something, which produced a cheerful, slightly heightened atmosphere through most of the day's lessons. Dinner was spectacular, the jack-o'-lanterns floated and the food was extraordinary, and even Hermione abandoned a study guide for approximately 20 minutes to enjoy it. Harry was in the middle of an argument with Ron about whether the Chudley Cannon's forward line was a structural problem or a management problem, Ron maintaining vigorously that it was management, Harry pointing out that you couldn't separate the two, when the door to the Great Hall opened and Professor Quirrell ran in. His face was wrong. Harry had been watching Quirrell since the second week of term with the specific attention he gave to things that created an itch at the back of his thinking. Quirrell was off. Not in any specific, classifiable way. More in the way that something is off when you're in a room and you can't identify the smell but you know there's one. His stutter, which was pronounced and apparently genuine, occasionally slipped in moments of something Harry would have called, not stress, exactly. Ambivalence. As if the stutter was real but the situations that dropped it were more interesting than the ones that sustained it. Quirrell ran in and announced, in a voice that was doing something more technically theatrical than actually frightened, that there was a troll in the dungeon. Harry watched him. Watched his hands. Watched the eyes. The eyes were wrong. They moved to a specific part of the hall, twice, quickly, like a correction, and then away. The hands were steady. People who are genuinely frightened have difficulty with their hands. Quirrell's were perfectly steady under the shaking of his performed panic. Students were screaming and moving toward exits. Dumbledore had risen and was restoring order with the massive, practiced calm of someone who has dealt with actual crises and finds panic management almost meditative. Prefects were ushering people to dormitories. Harry stood up. Harry, Ron said. Hermione didn't come down to dinner, Harry said. Ron blinked. Ran the social register of the past 2 hours. There was a thing, earlier, someone said something about her in the corridor. She's in the girls' bathroom on the 2nd floor, Harry said, because Hermione, when upset, went to bathrooms to recover because they were the only spaces in a school where you could have a guaranteed moment of privacy. He didn't explain all of this. Come on. They went against the tide of students moving toward the towers, and Ron, who had objected and then decided that objecting was wasting time better spent running, kept up. Harry moved through corridors that were rapidly emptying with the efficient, unhurried speed of someone who knows exactly where they're going. They heard the troll before they reached the 2nd floor. It was large and it smelled extraordinary, the dank, overwhelming smell of something that had developed in damp conditions and not been introduced to hygiene as a concept. It was in the girls' bathroom corridor because of course it was, because Harry could see exactly how this had been arranged, the timing and the placement too precise for accident, and the awareness of that precision sat cold and flat in his chest as he rounded the corner and found 12 feet of mountain troll attempting to introduce its club to the plumbing. Hermione was in the far corner of the room, pressed against the wall, her face white, her eyes on the troll with the specific paralyzed quality of someone whose excellent brain has momentarily been overtaken by the more ancient system that recognizes predator and produces freeze. Harry didn't stop to think about the plan. Plans were for situations you had time to plan. He stepped into the bathroom doorway, raised his wand, and said, very clearly, Wingardium Leviosa. He wasn't aiming at the Trolls Club. He was aiming at the troll. The troll was large and stupid and extremely heavy, but the levitation charm doesn't much care about any of those things if the magic behind it is strong enough and the intent is absolutely clear. The troll left the ground. Not gracefully, it rotated as it rose, confused in the profound and absolute way of creatures whose worldview doesn't contain the concept of up while not jumping, and it made a sound like several unpleasant things happening simultaneously. Harry held it there, 3 feet off the ground, rotating gently, for exactly as long as it took Ron to get to Hermione and get her to her feet and get her moving toward the door. Then he dropped it. The crash was significant. The troll lay on the bathroom floor looking at the ceiling and apparently rethinking several decisions. Harry lowered his wand. Hermione was in the corridor with Ron's hand on her shoulder, and she was shaking, and she was looking at Harry with an expression that was several things at once, gratitude, shock, and underneath both of those, something more analytical. She'd felt the charm. She'd felt the weight of magic that had gone into it. She was filing things, Harry could see it, adding data to the picture she was building. Are you all right? Harry said. Yes, Hermione said, which was technically accurate in the sense that she was standing upright and uninjured. That levitation charm, later, Harry said, because he could hear Professors McGonagall and Snape and Quirrell coming at a run from the far end of the corridor. He turned to face them. Snape arrived first. He looked at Harry, at Ron, at Hermione, at the bathroom where the troll was still making sounds, and then back at Harry, in the rapid way of someone doing an assessment. His eyes moved to Harry's wand, still warm, still the faintest glow of recent use, and something in his expression did the thing it kept doing when it encountered Harry Potter, the recalculation thing. McGonagall was next, and she looked devastated in the way that people who have organized everything very carefully look when the organization has clearly failed in a specific spot. Her mouth was thin and her eyes were frightened underneath the control. What in Merlin's name, Hermione was here, Harry said. She didn't hear the warning. We came to find her. He kept it simple. The simpler the better when adults were frightened. Frightened adults have limited processing capacity for complicated narratives. McGonagall looked at Hermione, who had composed herself to a remarkable degree in 30 seconds and was standing straight, and then at Harry with something he recognized as the precursor to gratitude fighting with the obligation to assigned attention. Quirrell, who had arrived last, was looking at the bathroom with his hands clasped and his face in its performed configuration of panic. Harry glanced at him and for a half-second, through the specific clarity he carried when his magic was hot from recent use, he felt it, something layered. Something in Quirrell that was not Quirrell. He kept his face neutral. Quirrell's eyes met his, briefly, and in that brief moment Quirrell's face did something very fast and very small that the turban at the back of his head seemed, almost perceptibly, to move toward. Harry looked away. After the teachers had sent them back to Gryffindor Tower, after the relief of the common room and the warmth and the fire and Fred and George descending with 20 questions, after Ron had told the story twice and Hermione had corrected it both times, Harry sat in the corner chair and looked at the fire in the grate. Fawkes was not here, not physically. But the warmth at the edge of his awareness, that constant, steady warmth, had a quality tonight that it sometimes had when something important had just happened. Not alarm. Not urgency. Something more like, pay attention. I know, Harry thought back. I already am. He stared at the fire and thought about a professor who didn't stutter when he thought no one was watching. He thought about a third-floor corridor with a door set flush in the wall and wards so fresh they almost smelled new. He thought about 73 charms burned away by a phoenix acting on its own nature, and about a chess grandmaster who'd built a board over 11 years and come in to find the pieces rearranged. He thought about all of it, patiently and thoroughly, the way you work through a long proof, not rushing to the conclusion, but not shying away from it either. Then he went to bed, and slept soundly, and dreamed of flying. Chapter 3. What the Fire Sees. November came in cold and grey and honest, the way November always does, stripping the last pretense of autumn off the trees and making the grounds of Hogwarts look like something from a painting made by someone who understood that beauty and severity are not opposites. Harry was up on the Quidditch pitch at 6 in the morning, 3 days into the month, flying alone. Oliver Wood had discovered early that Harry didn't need the standard new player orientation, the one where you explained that the snitch was small and gold and you caught it to end the game. Harry had shown up to his first team practice already knowing the rules in detail, already on the broom before Wood finished his opening sentence, and had spotted the practice snitch from 200 feet in dim evening light with the casual accuracy of someone identifying a face in a crowd. Wood, who ran his team practices with the religious dedication of a man for whom Quidditch was less a sport than a calling, had spent the first 20 minutes watching Harry fly with the expression of someone opening a birthday present they hadn't expected. "You're a natural," Wood had said. "I know," Harry had said, not arrogantly, just as a fact, the way you'd confirm a direction if someone told you which way was north. So the team practices were useful but not particularly challenging, and Harry had taken to flying alone in the early mornings because the sky at 6 o'clock with no one else in it was one of the most honest places he'd found since arriving at Hogwarts. Just him and the cold air and the castle below and the forest at the edge of the grounds. No being watched. No being assessed. Just the broom moving exactly where he asked it to and the horizon staying put regardless of how fast he came at it. He was mid-dive, the ground rushing up with the particular intimacy of terminal velocity, when he felt the familiar warmth spike, not alarmed, but heightened, the way a fire brightens when a draft comes through. He pulled up 20 feet from the grass, the broom responding instantly, and brought it to a hover. On the topmost turret of the astronomy tower, visible as a small bright point against the grey sky, something burned gold and red. Harry watched it for a moment. Fawkes watched back. "What are you looking at?" Harry thought. The warmth shifted, communicating in the specific non-language they'd built between them over 11 years, not words but images, impressions, the way music tells you something without saying it. This one was, layers. Something with layers. Harry looked toward the castle. "I know," he said aloud, to the cold air. "I'm working on it." He flew one more lap of the pitch and then brought the broom down and went inside. The defense against the dark arts classroom had a problem, and the problem was that Harry had figured it out and didn't know what to do with the information yet. Quirrell's lessons were, technically fine. The content was accurate, the examples were appropriate for first year, and if you were a student arriving with no prior knowledge and no particular reason to pay close attention to the professor as a person rather than a source of information, you would learn something useful and leave the classroom having been adequately taught. Harry was not that student. He sat in the front row, deliberately, since the second lesson, because the front row meant he could watch Quirrell without turning around and because the front row is where students go who are engaged rather than students who are hiding, and he paid attention to the lesson and simultaneously paid attention to everything surrounding the lesson, the way you watch a stage performance and also notice the machinery of the theater. Quirrell stuttered on his own name. He stuttered on room numbers and dates and the names of dark creatures. He did not stutter on incantations. He did not stutter on the properties of curses, their structure, their counters, their history. He did not stutter on power. The turban was always there. Always slightly asymmetrical in a way that suggested it was covering rather than simply sitting. Always slightly warm in Harry's perception, in the specific way that was not Fawkes's warmth, not clean and broad, but hot and narrow, like a focused point. Quirrell, Harry had concluded, was a man with a passenger. What kind of passenger, and how, and what it meant for the wards on the third floor and the thing behind them, that was the part he was still building. "Mr. Potter," Quirrell said, on a Tuesday in the second week of November. He'd asked a question about the counter jinx for a knockback jinx, and Harry had given the answer correctly and briefly, the way he gave all answers, without theater, without raising his hand with excessive enthusiasm. "Can you elaborate on the wand movement?" Harry elaborated on the wand movement. He kept his eyes on Quirrell's face. Quirrell's face was attentive, professionally so. But his right hand, resting on the desk beside his notes, was doing something very small and very specific. It had turned over so the palm faced upward. It was the most unconscious gesture Harry had ever watched anyone make, and it happened every time Harry spoke in class. Palm up. Receiving. As if something in Quirrell was instinctively orienting toward Harry when Harry's magic was active. Harry finished his elaboration and looked down at his notes. He wrote, in the margin, very small, "It's feeding." "You've been weird for 3 days," Ron said at dinner on Thursday. "Weirder than usual. You've got your thinking face." "I have a thinking face?" "It's very subtle," Ron said. "You look exactly the same except your eyes go about 15% more somewhere else." Harry looked at him. Ron shrugged, unoffended by his own assessment. "It's Quirrell," Harry said. He kept his voice low. The Gryffindor table was loud enough at dinner that a low conversation was effectively private. "Something's wrong with him." Ron stopped chewing for a moment. "Wrong how?" "I think he's carrying something. Something that isn't him." Silence for a beat. Ron resumed chewing, but thoughtfully. Harry had come to appreciate, very good at receiving unexpected information without catastrophizing it. Ron's family had clearly introduced him to a broad enough range of magical strangeness that his threshold for that can't be real was set much higher than most. "Like a possession?" Ron said. "Partial," Harry said. "I think it's partial. He's still him, most of the time. But there's something else sharing the space. And that something is, what? What are you thinking it is?" Harry looked at his plate. "I have a theory," he said. "I'm not ready to say it out loud yet." Ron looked at him for a moment. "Because saying it out loud makes it real?" "Because saying it out loud without sufficient evidence is just speculation," Harry said. "And speculation spreads." Ron considered this. "Fair enough," he said, and went back to his dinner. "What are we doing about it?" Harry felt something warm in his chest that had nothing to do with Fawkes. "I'm not sure yet." "Right, but when you are sure, you'll tell us?" "Us," Harry repeated. "You, me, Hermione," Ron said. "Obviously." "Neville too," Harry said. Ron raised his eyebrows fractionally. "Neville? He's better than he thinks he is," Harry said. "And he has reason." Ron was quiet for a moment, looking at Neville 3 seats down, who was attempting to explain Trevor's latest escape to Dean Thomas with the specific resigned affection of someone who has accepted that a relationship is going to be like this. "Yeah," Ron said, after a moment. "Yeah, all right." Hermione had been conducting her own investigation, which Harry discovered on Friday evening when he came to their usual library table and found she'd reorganized the books he'd laid out the night before into a different configuration with a note that said, "I think your filing system lacks a coherent principle. Also look at Chapter 9. He sat down and looked at Chapter 9 of the Phoenix Lore book, which he'd already read twice, and found a passage she'd marked with a small tab. The passage was about Phoenix perception, specifically about the way a phoenix's bond with a human altered the human's magical perception. Not expanded it, exactly. Clarified it. The text described it as the burning away of interference, which made Harry stop and read the sentence 3 times. Hermione arrived 8 minutes later, sat down, and said, "You saw it. The interference language. It correlates with what the magical theory books say about monitoring charms," she said. "If you've had something disrupting your natural magical perception since very early," she paused. "Harry, I think you see things other people don't because something was removed that should have been preventing you from seeing them." Harry set the book down carefully. "What kind of things?" "Layers," Hermione said. "Intent. The structure underneath the surface of spells and people and places." She looked at him with the particular intensity she brought to moments when she'd worked something out that she was fairly sure she was right about. When you modified Snape's potion recipe in the first lesson, you said you read the knotgrass properties and the stirring mechanics and worked it out. But Neville read the same textbook and he didn't work it out. I read the same textbook. I understand it now, when you explain it. But I didn't see it in the reading. You would have eventually, Harry said. Maybe, she said. The point is that you see the mechanism underneath the instruction. The reason the instruction exists. And I think, she bit her lip, which she did when she was about to say something she was 90% sure of but hadn't fully verified. I think that's what the bond does, in combination with what was removed. You see through the surface of things. Harry was quiet for a moment. Like Quirrell, he said. Hermione went still. What about Quirrell? He told her. She listened with the focused, uninterrupted attention she gave to information she was going to need to act on, and when he finished she was quiet for long enough that Harry could hear the distant sounds of the library settling around them. The warmth you feel from the turban, she said finally. Narrow. Pointed. Not like Fawkes. No. Harry. She looked at him directly. I looked up the history of you-know-who's, Voldemort's, last known location before Godric's Hollow. She said the name with careful, deliberate intent, the way you'd use a sharp tool. There's almost nothing in the books. Censorship, I think, or willful historical vagueness. But I found a reference in a 1982 pamphlet from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement that described it as the site of an incomplete magical act. She paused. Incomplete. Not failed. Incomplete. The library was very quiet around them. Something survived, Harry said. Something survived, Hermione confirmed. They looked at each other across the table, with the shared, steady feeling of two people who have followed a line of reasoning somewhere neither of them particularly wanted to go and arrived at the same place at the same time. The thing behind the third-floor door, Harry said. The wards are Dumbledore's, Hermione said. I've been trying to identify them from what I can feel when I walk past. His signature is distinctive. But there are other signatures on top. Older ones. He's protecting something, Harry said. Something that whatever's living in Quirrell wants. Yes. Harry leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. The library's enchanted candles guttered softly above him. How long has Quirrell been at Hogwarts? This is his first year teaching defense, Hermione said immediately. Before that he taught Muggle studies for 4 years. But he spent last year on sabbatical. She paused. Albania. There's a reference in the staff listing from last year's Hogwarts prospectus. Which I found in the archival section. Of course you did, Harry said. He went to Albania and came back with something sharing his head, Hermione said. Something that knows what's behind the third-floor door and wants it. She folded her hands on the table. The question is what it is and what we're supposed to do about it. I know what it is, Harry said. Hermione looked at him. I'm not saying it out loud yet, Harry said. But I know. She studied him for a moment. The scar, she said. When you're near him. Does it hurt? No, Harry said, and something moved across his face that was too fast to catch, something that was not quite the thing it would have been if she'd asked a slightly different question. It doesn't hurt. December arrived and with it Quidditch, the first match of the season, Gryffindor versus Slytherin on a morning that was bright and ferociously cold. The stands were packed. Harry had spent the previous 2 weeks in team practices that would have escalated to an intensity that bordered on religious, and he'd spent his own time flying, adjusting, refining, not learning, because flying was one of the things that had come to him complete, but practicing, because practice and learning are different things and Harry understood the difference. The match was attended by the entire school and all the staff. Harry noticed, from the height of his opening circuit of the pitch, that Quirrell was in the stands in the Slytherin section, next to Snape, and that Snape was watching Harry with an attention that was different from his classroom attention, sharper, more specific. He filed this and focused on the pitch. Slytherin played hard and rough, in the way that teams coached for physical intimidation play, with the understanding that the discomfort of the other team is itself a tactic. Their beaters were precise in targeting Gryffindor's chasers. Their keeper was excellent. Their seeker, a sixth-year named Terence Higgs, was experienced and fast. Harry ignored all of this in the specific way that people who are genuinely good at something ignore the opponent, not dismissively, but with the confidence of someone who knows that their game is their own and the opponent is a variable, not a threat. He flew high and wide, getting the full picture of the pitch, watching the pattern of the other players and the movement of the 3 red balls and listening, underneath everything, for the feeling that the snitch produced, not quite a sound, but a ripple in the air, something his perception registered before his eyes could. 11 minutes in, Gryffindor was up 40 points. The Gryffindor chasers, Angelina, Alicia, and Katie, were extraordinary and working in combinations they'd clearly been running for years. Harry let them work and kept looking. 15 minutes in, his broom shuddered. Not a gust, the day was still, cold, barely any wind. A shudder, from inside the mechanism. The broom bucked under him and he caught it with his knees, adjusting instinctively, and then it bucked again, harder, trying to shake him. In the stands, Hermione grabbed Ron's arm. "Jinx," she said, already looking. "Who?" Ron said. Hermione scanned. She had read Quidditch Through the Ages and 2 additional volumes on magical interference, and she knew what a continuous jinx looked like: constant murmured incantation, no blinking, focused eye contact with the target. She was looking for someone who wasn't cheering, wasn't looking at the players generally, but had their eyes fixed specifically on. She found the eye contact. She found the murmuring. She found Snape. "Ron," she said, "distract me for 10 seconds. "What?" Ron said. "Distract me," Hermione said, already reaching into her bag for her wand. "I need to set a fire without anyone seeing me aim it." Ron, who had his moments of absolute decisiveness, immediately stood up and knocked over the entirety of the hot chocolate supply that Neville had been holding, producing a commotion of exactly sufficient scale. In the chaos of 6 people and Neville's profound apologies, Hermione slipped her wand out and set a small, precise fire on the hem of Snape's robes. The murmuring stopped. In the air, Harry's broom steadied under him like a horse settling after a fright. He ran a hand along the handle, feeling the enchantments normalize, and looked down at the stands with an expression no one near him could read. Then he looked up. The snitch was 6 feet above his head, hovering with the specific uncertainty of something that knows it's been noticed. Harry took it in 4 seconds. The match ended. Gryffindor won. The stands exploded. Wood cried, which he seemed to do after victories with a regularity that suggested he'd made a kind of peace with it. Fred and George appeared from somewhere and lifted Harry bodily off the ground. Harry let them carry him for a moment, looking over Fred's shoulder across the pitch. In the stands, Snape was inspecting the hem of his robes with an expression like a thundercloud with a personal grievance. He looked up and across the pitch and his eyes found Harry's at exactly the wrong moment, and Harry looked back at him, and then Hermione was there, and Ron, and the noise and the celebration absorbed everything. Later, much later, in the quiet of the dormitory, Harry lay on his back in the dark and turned over what he'd seen during the jinx. The intent behind it. He'd been watching Snape for weeks, in the same way he'd been watching Quirrell, and the 2 pictures were very different. Quirrell's attention toward Harry carried a quality he'd only recently found the right word for. Appetite. Not Quirrell's appetite, something else's, something using Quirrell's attention as a vehicle. Snape's attention was different. It was conflicted. The word kept coming back. A man who had positioned himself in a specific configuration around Harry Potter and was not entirely comfortable with any of the angles. The jinx, if it was a jinx, and he was increasingly not sure, had been aimed at the broom and not at Harry. Which was a meaningful distinction. He thought about this until he fell asleep. 2 days after the match, Harry went to see Snape. He knocked on the dungeon office door and waited. When the door opened, Snape looked at him with the expression he kept in reserve for unwanted arrivals, the one that said, "I am very busy and you are the least important thing that has happened to me this week." "Mr. Potter," Snape said. "Professor Snape," Harry said. "Do you have a few minutes?" "I do not," Snape said. He kept the door at 45 degrees, which was the angle of someone who had not yet committed to either opening it further or closing it entirely. "I'd like to ask you about the match on Saturday," Harry said. Silence. The 45 degrees held. "I'm not here to make a complaint," Harry added. "I want to understand what happened." Another silence, longer. Snape's face was doing the thing, not the recalculation thing this time, something different. The specific expression of a man who has been approached in a way he didn't anticipate and is deciding what it means. He opened the door. Harry sat in the chair in front of the desk without being invited to, which Snape noted with a slight narrowing of the eyes that was more assessment than annoyance. Snape went behind the desk and sat, and they looked at each other across the surface of it. "You were watching my broom," Harry said. "Yes," Snape said. "Just that. Not defensive, not explanatory." "You were counter-jinxing it," Harry said. "Not jinxing it. Counter-jinxing." A very long pause. Snape's face was absolutely still. "Someone else jinxed it first," Harry said. "And you were fixing it. What makes you think that?" Snape said, which was not a denial. "The timing," Harry said. "And the angle. And the fact that when the jinx stopped, my broom steadied rather than dropped, which means the jinx wasn't creating the instability, it was fighting something else that was creating it." He kept his eyes on Snape's face. "You were looking at me the entire match, but not in the same way Quirrell was." At the word Quirrell, something happened in Snape's face. Small, fast, contained immediately. But it was there, and it carried specific information, not surprise. Snape was not surprised that Harry had noticed Quirrell. "You're an observant child," Snape said, in a tone that was not quite the dismissive one he usually aimed at that word. "Who was Quirrell looking at during the match?" Harry said. "Mr. Potter, was he trying to jinx my broom or was he doing something else?" Harry said. He leaned forward slightly. "I'm not asking you to tell me things you don't want to tell me. I'm asking you to help me understand whether I need to be worried about Quirrell or whether there's a different angle I'm missing." Snape looked at him for a long moment with those flat, dark eyes. Looked at him the way you look at something that isn't fitting the pattern you built to contain it. "Quirrell," Snape said finally, carefully, "is a matter being handled by people with more authority than yourself." "Handled how?" Harry said. "Handled with appropriate oversight," Snape said, which was not an answer to Harry's question but was itself informative. "You are a first year, Mr. Potter. There are situations in this school that are not your responsibility to resolve." "No," Harry said. "But they might become mine if the people handling them with appropriate oversight don't finish handling them before something goes wrong." He held Snape's gaze. "Something's going to go wrong. That's not pessimism. It's a reading of the current trajectory." Silence in the dungeon. The sound of something bubbling softly in the preparation room next door. The cold October draft from the high dungeon windows. "You are 11 years old," Snape said. He said it not with contempt but with the measured weight of someone stating a fact they want the other person to actually hear. "Yes," Harry said. "And?" Another long silence. Snape pressed 2 fingers against his lips, an unguarded gesture that Harry recognized as the one he made when something was genuinely making him think rather than merely annoying him. Then he said, "You should not be in Quirrell's class unless you have to be." "I can't drop a required course in first year," Harry said. "Then sit in the back," Snape said. Harry looked at him. "I sit in the front so I can watch him." Snape closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, his expression had settled into something that was not warmth, was not softness, but was the very distant cousin of respect, the look you give something that is proving irritatingly difficult to dismiss. Your mother, he said, also could not leave a problem alone once she'd identified it. The sentence landed quietly in the room. Harry was completely still for a moment. You knew her, he said. We were. Snape paused on the word, and it was a pause that lasted long enough to contain a great deal. Acquainted, he said finally, which was clearly not the word he'd started toward. Harry sat with this for a moment and then he stood up. Thank you, Professor, he said. I didn't tell you anything, Snape said. You told me more than you think, Harry said, and went to the door. He stopped with his hand on it. For what it's worth, what you did during the match. Thank you for that too. He left without waiting for a response. Behind him, Severus Snape sat very still in his dungeon office for a long time, looking at the door that had just closed, and thought about Lily Potter's eyes looking at him from a face that was, unambiguously, James Potter's, and the deeply irritating fact that the combination of those two things had apparently produced a child who could walk into a room and see things that most grown wizards spent careers learning not to miss. A week before Christmas, Harry was in the library alone, and Dumbledore came to find him. He'd known it was coming. The headmaster had been building toward it since the first night, circling, taking measurements, creating opportunities for accidental conversation that Harry had attended to politely and not given more than was given to him. He'd been patient in the way that people are patient when they have absolute confidence in their own timing, and Harry had been patient in a different way, the way you're patient when you know something is coming and you want to be ready for it. Dumbledore came into the library at 8 in the evening with a plate of lemon drops and sat down across the table from Harry as if they sat across tables from each other every evening, and Harry put down his book and looked at him. Good evening, Professor Dumbledore, Harry said. Good evening, Harry. Dumbledore offered the plate of lemon drops. Harry took one and set it on the table beside him without eating it. A small thing. Dumbledore noticed, and his eyes were very bright behind the half-moon spectacles. How are you finding Hogwarts? Excellent, Harry said. The library is particularly good. The Transfiguration curriculum could go deeper, but I imagine it's calibrated for the average level of the year group. Indeed it is, Dumbledore said. Though I understand from Minerva that the average level of this year group may be somewhat higher than usual. He settled into his chair with the unhurried ease of a man who has all the time in the world. How is your wand settling? Very well, Harry said. Ollivander told me it was a peculiar match, Dumbledore said, in a tone of such casual conversational interest that most people would have answered the implied question automatically. A phoenix feather core from a wild bird. He said it was the most remarkable match he'd made in 20 years. He was kind to say so, Harry said. Dumbledore smiled, slowly. You're going to make me work for this, aren't you? I'm not sure what you mean, Harry said, which was the politest possible version of, yes, obviously. The smile didn't waver, and it was genuine. Harry could tell the difference, had been able to tell the difference for as long as he could remember, between performed warmth and actual warmth, and what Dumbledore was feeling right now was something genuine, even if it was complicated. Amusement, yes, but underneath that something more careful. The feeling of a man looking at a situation and deciding how much of himself to put into the next move. I would like to know, Dumbledore said, how you've been. Not academically. Generally. He paused. How life at the Dursleys was, growing up. Harry looked at him. The question was genuine, he could feel that too. And underneath the genuineness was the specific quality of a man who has decided to ask a question he already knows the shape of the answer to, because the asking matters even when the answer is known. It was what it was, Harry said. Not cruel. Not warm. A kind of managed absence. He kept his eyes on Dumbledore. You know this. You placed me there. Yes, Dumbledore said, simply. I did. For the blood protection. Yes. Which I'm sure worked, Harry said. And which I also suspect was not the only reason. Silence. Dumbledore looked at his hands on the table, the same way Harry had looked at his hands, the same gesture. Something in Harry registered this with a precision that sat under his sternum like a stone. There were monitoring charms, Harry said. On me. Placed over my first 11 years. Someone told me. This was not entirely true, no one had told him in words. But Fawkes had shown him, which was a form of telling. They were removed. Yes, Dumbledore said again, very quietly. You placed them, Harry said. The silence this time was different. Longer. Heavier. The quality of a silence in which something true is sitting, waiting for the person it belongs to pick it up. Yes, Dumbledore said. Harry looked at him for a moment. Why, he said. Not with anger. With the same clear, direct attention he gave everything. The question of someone who wants to understand, not to condemn. Because there is a prophecy, Dumbledore said. And because the prophecy concerns you. And because, he stopped. He looked at his hands again. Because I have spent a very long time being responsible for a great many lives, Harry, and the weight of that responsibility has sometimes led me to believe that if I could see all the variables, control all the variables, I could prevent the worst outcomes. He looked up. That belief, honestly examined, is not always distinguishable from arrogance. Harry was very still. You're being honest, Harry said. I'm trying to be, Dumbledore said. It is not always my natural inclination, which is itself a failing worth noting. The fire in the library grate crackled softly between them. Harry reached for the lemon drop he'd set on the table and ate it. Dumbledore watched this with the small, genuine smile of someone noting a deliberate gesture. The prophecy, Harry said. Can you tell me what it says? Not tonight, Dumbledore said. Not because I intend to keep it from you permanently. Because there are things you need to understand first, and because this year is not yet over, and because, he paused, and the pause had weight. Because I want to earn the right to that conversation rather than simply have it because I have the authority to. If you'll allow me the time to do that. Harry looked at him for a long time. The old wizard didn't look away, didn't smile, didn't perform anything. He just sat there with the weight of what he'd said and waited. All right, Harry said. But I'm going to keep looking into Quirrell. Harry, I know it's being handled, Harry said. I know you know what I've noticed and I know you're aware of the situation. I'm not going to interfere with your plans. He met Dumbledore's eyes. But I'm going to keep looking. Because what's in that corridor is connected to what's in Quirrell, and whatever is connected to both of those things is connected to me, and I don't sit on the sidelines of things that are connected to me. Dumbledore looked at him. And then, quietly, he said, You're very much like your mother. Snape said the same thing, Harry said. Something moved through Dumbledore's expression at that, surprise, genuine this time, and then something more complex and more personal that settled into a look of quiet recognition. Did he said. Yes. Harry stood up and picked up his book. Good night, Professor Dumbledore. Good night, Harry, Dumbledore said. He stayed at the table after Harry left, hands folded, looking at the fire, and thought about what it meant when the piece you'd spent 11 years shaping refused the shape, and was better for it, and you were self-aware enough to know both things were true simultaneously. Above the library, in the tower, Fawkes sang one phrase of something that wasn't any song anyone had ever written down. It floated through the stone and the wood and the spaces between. Dumbledore heard it from the library. His eyes closed for a moment. The fire in the grate burned a shade brighter, and in its brightness you could see, if you were paying the right kind of attention, something burning away. Chapter 4, The Mirror Doesn't Like Christmas at Hogwarts was quieter than Harry had expected, and he found he liked it. Most students went home for the holidays. The castle thinned out like a crowd after a concert, gradually, in stages, until the corridors that had been full of noise and motion became something more like themselves, the old stone getting a chance to breathe. The great hall shrank to one table near the fire for the handful of students who stayed, and the food was still extravagant and the decorations were still enormous and the whole effect was intimate in a way the full school couldn't manage. Harry stayed because there was nothing at Privet Drive that qualified as a holiday, and because there were things in the castle he hadn't finished looking at. Ron stayed too, because his parents were visiting Charlie in Romania, and because he seemed genuinely pleased about it rather than disappointed, happy to be in the castle without the social mathematics of the full-year group, content to eat too much and play chess and be generally without agenda. It was one of the things Harry valued most about Ron, his absolute comfort with stillness. He never needed anything to be more than it was. Hermione had gone home with a stack of books large enough that her mother had reportedly looked at the trunk and said something that Hermione, relaying this, declined to quote directly. Neville had gone home to his grandmother, which he seemed resigned to in the way of someone who has accepted that certain experiences are finite and survivable. So it was Harry and Ron and a few others Harry knew less well, and the castle at Christmas, which turned out to have a specific quality of magic that the full-term version couldn't replicate: warmer, slower, more itself. He'd been exploring. The third-floor corridor had been theoretically off-limits since the start of term. Dumbledore's opening speech had mentioned it with the specific quality of a prohibition designed to be noticed, not casual, not buried, but placed at the center of the address where everyone would register it, which meant Dumbledore had wanted it registered. The prohibition was real, but it was also, Harry had concluded, partly architectural. A wall with a sign on it is still a wall. But a prohibition that everyone knows about and talks about becomes, over time, a kind of landscape feature. Nobody questions landscape features. He didn't go through the door. Not yet. He'd been mapping the space around it, the enchantments, their age and character, the way they distributed outward from the locked door in overlapping layers. Dumbledore's signature was the outermost layer, recent, complex. Underneath that, something older and more specific, McGonagall's transfiguration work, unmistakable once you knew what you were looking for. And underneath that, deeper, the layered work of several other practitioners whose signatures he hadn't identified yet. There was something living behind the door. Large. He could feel it through the stone, not hear it, exactly, but feel its weight, the displacement of air when it breathed. He filed this away and kept mapping. On Christmas morning, Harry came downstairs to find a small pile of packages at the foot of his dormitory bed, which surprised him for reasons he hadn't fully examined yet: the assumption of absence, the habit of 11 years in which presents were not part of December. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them for a moment. From Ron, a box of chocolate frogs and a handwritten note that said, "Mum insists, she's been saying all term she wants to adopt you. I told her to wait until she'd met you properly but she didn't listen." And then, below that in different ink as if added later, "She also wants to know if you like treacle tart. Do you?" Harry smiled at this and ate one of the frogs and set the card from Ptolemy aside. From Hermione, a book. Naturally. Advanced Magical Theory by Adalbert Waffling, with a bookmark at Chapter 12 and a note in Hermione's precise handwriting. Chapter 12 is relevant to our current working theory. Also Chapters 8 and 17. Happy Christmas. He opened to Chapter 12 immediately. From Hagrid, whose enormous handwriting on the label had made the package identifiable before he'd opened it, a hand-carved flute. He held it for a moment, feeling the warmth in it that came not from any spell but from the hands that had made it, hours of patient work, the kind of gift that takes time rather than money, which is a different category of thoughtful. He set it carefully on his nightstand. And then there was one more package, which had no label. He turned it over. No name on it anywhere. The paper was thick and silvery, not gift wrap but fabric, something that moved oddly in the winter light coming through the dormitory window. He unwrapped it and a mass of material fell out into his hands, pale and liquid and strangely, profoundly light, and when he held it up it caught no light at all, threw no shadow, and the hand behind it disappeared. He looked at his hand where the cloak covered it. No hand. He moved his fingers. Nothing. An invisibility cloak. There was a note tucked inside the folds. Your father left this in my possession before he died. It is time it was returned to you. Use it well. A very Merry Christmas to you. No signature. Harry read the note twice. He set it down on the bed and held the cloak in both hands and thought about his father leaving something in someone's possession before he died, the weight of that, the timeline of it, what it meant about someone who'd known his father well enough to be trusted with something like this. He thought about the phrasing, time it was returned. The word returned, which implied it had always been his, even before he could own anything. He put the cloak on and went to the mirror and saw nothing and felt, in a way he hadn't expected, the loss of that. Not the invisibility, the nothing. The reflection that should have been there, the evidence of his own existence, visible and real. It was a useful tool. It was also, for the duration of exactly 1 second, a reminder of what it felt like to be made invisible by other means. He took the cloak off and folded it carefully and put it in his trunk. It was Ron who found the mirror. They'd been wandering the castle that evening after dinner, doing the kind of aimless navigation that's actually the specific activity of learning the shape of something large, and they'd taken a wrong turn on the 7th floor and come through a door that opened into a long, dusty classroom that was clearly used for storage, broken furniture, rolled-up rugs, boxes of Merlin knows what stacked to the ceiling. And in the middle of it, propped against the far wall, a mirror. It was enormous, taller than either of them by a factor that made you feel appropriately small. The frame was gold, ornate in a way that managed not to be ugly, with an inscription curving around the top that Harry squinted at, Erist stra eru oit ube kafru oit on wosi. What does that mean? Ron said. Harry read it backwards, subtracting the spaces and replacing them. I show not your face but your heart's desire, he said. Ron went quiet. Then he went toward the mirror. Harry stayed where he was, near the door, and watched Ron's face change. The change was gradual and specific. Ron stood in front of the mirror and his expression went through several things, surprise, confusion, something soft and private that Harry looked away from because it was Ron's and not his to observe. After a moment Ron laughed, short and slightly embarrassed. I'm head boy, he said. And Quidditch captain. And, he stopped. It's me, but sort of, better. More recognized, Harry said. Ron looked at him. Yeah, he said, after a pause. Something like that. He stepped back from the mirror. There was a moment where Harry could see him deciding whether to feel embarrassed about what he'd seen, and then deciding not to, one of Ron's best qualities, the speed with which he metabolized self-knowledge. Your turn, he said. Harry crossed the room. He stood in front of the mirror of Erist and looked at his reflection. What he saw was not what he'd expected to see. He'd expected his parents, or if not his parents, then something adjacent, a family, people who looked like him, the absence made visible and filled. That was the pattern. He'd read about the mirror, not by name but by function. Hermione had described mirrors of desire in the context of dark enchantment taxonomy, and the mechanism was clear enough. Most people saw what they most lacked. But Harry stood in front of the mirror of Erist and what he saw was himself. Exactly himself. Not better, not improved, not surrounded by people or standing in some position of achievement or recognition. Just himself, standing in front of a mirror, looking back. Except the reflection's eyes were different. Not in color, still green. But the quality of the light behind them was different, and in the mirror Harry could see it clearly in a way he'd never been able to see it in ordinary mirrors, the warmth that came from the bond, the phoenix fire, visible as a very faint gold in the green of the eyes. Himself with the bond visible. Himself as he actually was, underneath everything. He stood there and the reflection stood there and they looked at each other, and what Harry felt, standing in front of the most powerful enchanted mirror in Britain which was designed to show you what you most desperately wanted, was complete. Not satisfied. Not content to stop. Complete. Whole. The difference between a fire that burns because it's contained and a fire that burns because that's what fire does. What do you see? Ron said softly. Myself, Harry said. Ron looked at him for a moment. That's it? That's it, Harry said. He stepped back from the mirror, and something shifted in the room, the air, the quality of it, the way magic sometimes responds to significant moments with the subtlest physical adjustment, a drop in temperature or a shift in the light. The candles in the sconces flickered once. Harry looked up at them and then back at the mirror. Ron, he said. We should go. Why? Ron said, looking at the mirror with the expression of someone who wanted to go back. Because this thing is in here for a reason, Harry said. It wasn't storage. It was placed. He looked at the inscription again and at the frame and at the quality of the enchantments layered around the glass. They had a direction, an intention. And I think someone knows it's here, and I think they're not going to be pleased that we found it. Ron looked around the dusty room with its broken furniture and cobwebs. It looks like it's been here for years. The magic on it is recent, Harry said. The dust is old. Someone moved it here this term. He looked at the mirror once more, and the mirror showed him himself with fire in his eyes, and he looked away and they left. He went back to the mirror alone that night, with the invisibility cloak, because there were things about it he hadn't finished understanding. He stood in front of it in the dark and looked at his reflection for a long time and thought about what it meant, the cloak, the mirror, the sequence of events that had produced both of them in his hands on the same day. He thought about a headmaster who sent presents without signatures and who had been honest, 3 weeks ago in the library, in a way that cost him something, and who was building toward a longer conversation that Harry had agreed to wait for. He thought about trust and its complications. Not naively, he'd been thinking about Dumbledore with the same clear assessment he gave everything, which meant he'd been thinking about the charms alongside the library conversation, the arrangement with the Dursleys alongside the clear genuine care, the chess playing alongside the honesty. Dumbledore was a man of profound contradictions who resolved them through certainty, and the certainty was the issue. Not the care. The certainty. He was still thinking about this when he heard footsteps in the corridor. He stepped back into the shadow of a stack of furniture, cloak tight around him, and waited. Dumbledore came through the door. He was alone, and he was wearing robes that suggested he hadn't come from bed, he hadn't been sleeping, or if he had it had been the light sleep of someone waiting for something. He came to the mirror and stood in front of it and looked at his own reflection, and his face did something very private that Harry looked away from, because whatever Dumbledore saw in the mirror was between Dumbledore and himself. After a long moment, Dumbledore said, "I know you're here, Harry." Harry pulled the cloak off. "How?" he said. "This is my school," Dumbledore said, mildly, "and I have been here a very long time." He turned from the mirror. "Also, I can see you perfectly well." Harry looked at the cloak in his hands. "The cloak doesn't work on you. Very little is fully invisible to someone who knows what they're looking for," Dumbledore said. He came away from the mirror and sat down in a chair that was probably not intended for sitting but was solid enough to manage it. "What do you see in it?" "Myself," Harry said, for the second time that day. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "Just yourself," he said, and his voice had a specific quality, not the casual conversational interest he'd used in the library. Something more genuine, a question he actually didn't know the answer to. "With the bond visible," Harry said. "The fire. I can see it in the reflection. I can't see it in normal mirrors." Dumbledore looked at him. He said, very carefully, "When I look in this mirror, Harry, I see myself holding something I lost a very long time ago. Something I want back." His voice was steady, but the steadiness was the kind you build rather than the kind you're born with. "What you've described is not the mirror showing you a desire. It's the mirror showing you a truth." Harry thought about this. "The enchantment amplifies desire," he said. But it can only amplify what's there. If what's already there is, he paused. Enough, he said. If what's there is enough. Then the mirror has nothing to add, Dumbledore said. They sat with that for a moment, in the dusty Christmas night quiet of the room. You've done something I didn't think was possible, Dumbledore said. He wasn't performing modesty or wisdom. He was making a statement of fact, with the blunt honesty of someone who has stopped managing the conversation and is just having it. I've watched a great many people look into that mirror. I've never seen anyone look into it and see what is rather than what is not. Maybe you've never watched someone look into it who had nothing taken from them, Harry said. Nothing fundamental. Nothing they needed to be whole. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. The charms, he said. Yes, Harry said. The charms. If they'd worked the way they were designed to, he thought about the compulsion toward anxiety, toward needing approval, toward the specific vulnerability that makes a person depend on the people managing them. I think the mirror would have shown me something else. Silence. I think you're right, Dumbledore said quietly. And then, with the weight of a man picking up something he's set down once and knows he has to carry, I'm sorry, Harry. For the charms. For the system I built around you without your consent. He looked at his hands. I had reasons, all of them real to me. But reasons and justifications are not the same thing, and I confused them for too long. Harry looked at him. The old wizard with the half-moon spectacles and the weight of decades of chess behind his eyes, sitting in a broken chair in a dusty room in front of a mirror that showed him something he'd lost and hadn't yet accepted losing. I know, Harry said. And I know the reasons were real. He paused. The prophecy is real, isn't it? Not symbolic. Actual. Yes. And it involves Voldemort and me specifically. Dumbledore looked at him sharply at the name. Harry held his gaze without apology. Yes, Dumbledore said. Then we're going to need to be honest with each other, Harry said. Not eventually. Going forward. Because what's in the third-floor corridor, he watched Dumbledore's face confirm it, and what's wearing Quirrell, those things are connected, and the thing they're connected to is connected to the prophecy, and I'm not going to help with any of it if I'm operating on incomplete information while you operate on everything. Dumbledore was quiet for a long time. The mirror stood silent behind him, its surface barely catching the dim light. The Philosopher's Stone, Dumbledore said, finally. Harry had suspected this from Hermione's research, from the timeline of the wards, from the quality and intensity of the protections he'd been mapping. Having it confirmed felt not like revelation but like a key turning. Flammel, he said. Nicholas, yes, Dumbledore said. It was moved here for safekeeping. The person attempting to access it, Voldemort, Harry said. What remains of Voldemort, Dumbledore said. A fragment. Alive but incomplete. Using Quirrell as a host. He looked at Harry steadily. I did not place it here to put you in danger. I placed it here because Hogwarts has the most layered protections of any location in Britain, and because I believed the protections would be sufficient. Do you still believe that? Harry said. A pause. I believe they will slow him considerably, Dumbledore said. That's not the same thing, Harry said. No, Dumbledore agreed. It isn't. Harry stood up. He was cold, the room was cold, and the conversation had arrived somewhere real and left him with the specific feeling of having mapped more territory accurately than he'd had before. Not comfort. Orientation. Tell me about the protections, he said. All of them. I've mapped the ones I can feel from the corridor. Tell me about the ones I can't. Dumbledore looked at him. There was a long moment, the moment of a man deciding whether to cross a line he's been standing at the edge of, whether to treat the person in front of him as the thing they are rather than the thing he's been managing them as. Sit down, Dumbledore said. Harry sat down. Dumbledore told him about the protections. New Year arrived and the students came back and the castle filled up again, and Harry moved through the first weeks of January with a different quality of attention than he'd had in December, wider, more deliberate, because now he had the full picture and the full picture was both clarifying and pressing. 7 protections. Fluffy, the 3-headed dog, which Harry had known about from the smell and the size of the weight he'd felt through the stone. Devil's Snare, Sprout's Work, botanical and smart. Flying Keys, Flitwick's Contribution, enchanted and deliberately confusing. A giant chess set, McGonagall's, which Harry had spent 2 evenings thinking about because chess was a system and systems had exploitable logic. A troll, already dealt with, though he hadn't known at the time that it was part of the sequence. A logic puzzle and poison, Snape's, which was elegant in its combination of chemistry and deduction. And the mirror itself, the final protection. Because the stone was in the mirror, Dumbledore had explained, and the mirror would give it only to someone who wanted to find it but not use it. Harry thought about Voldemort looking into the mirror. About what Voldemort saw in mirrors that showed heart's desire. He thought about a man who had unmade himself in pursuit of immortality, who had become less human with every step he'd taken toward the thing he most wanted, whether such a man could see anything in the mirror except the desire itself, the power, the impossible object, and whether that desire, reflected back, would produce the stone or produce nothing. He thought Dumbledore was right that the mirror was the most elegant protection of the 7, and he thought that confidence in elegance was itself a vulnerability, and he thought about what it meant that a version of Voldemort currently sharing a body with a Hogwarts professor was walking past all 6 preliminary protections every time he attended staff meetings. He mentioned this to Dumbledore in their second meeting. They had meetings now, on Tuesday evenings, which had started as informal conversations in the headmaster's office and had settled into something more structured. Harry came with questions. Dumbledore came with answers, more of them than Harry had expected, offered with the increasing ease of a man discovering that honesty felt better than management once you'd gotten past the initial adjustment. He can't access the corridor without triggering the wards, Dumbledore said. He's been managing his access very carefully, Harry said. Small tests. Not penetration, just pressure. Feeling where the edges are. Dumbledore looked at him. How do you know that? I've been feeling the wards twice daily since October, Harry said. There are places where they've been tested from the other side. The testing is methodical. Patient. He paused. Whoever is doing it knows protections well enough not to trigger them while mapping them. Voldemort was among the most skilled practitioners of ward breaking in the last century, Dumbledore said, with the specific tone of someone acknowledging something extremely inconvenient. Yes, Harry said. So the timeline is not as comfortable as the plan assumed. Dumbledore was quiet. The question isn't whether he'll break through, Harry said. It's when. And whether we want to wait for when and deal with it reactively, or whether there's something we can do that takes that variable off the board. Harry, not me going in there alone, Harry said. I know that's what you're about to say and I'm not suggesting it. I'm suggesting that you need to decide what the contingency plan is, and I need to be in that plan, because if something goes wrong without one I'm going to be in it anyway and I'd rather be in it with information. Dumbledore looked at him across the desk, and what moved across his face was something Harry recognized from their conversation in front of the mirror, the specific look of a man seeing something clearly that he'd been avoiding looking at directly. You're going to be in whatever happens, Dumbledore said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Harry said. I cannot in good conscience, Professor Dumbledore, Harry said, with complete patience. I have a wild phoenix bond that's been in place since I was 15 months old. I can see through the surface of enchantments and people. I've been mapping your protection system for 3 months and I understand it in detail. I am the subject of a prophecy that directly concerns Voldemort. He paused. I'm not trying to put myself in the center of something for the sake of it. I'm telling you I'm already in the center of it, and have been since before I could walk. The question is just whether I face what's coming informed or uninformed. A long silence. Your mother argued the same way, Dumbledore said, softly. When I tried to keep her out of order operations because she was too young. Was she right? Harry said. She was almost always right, Dumbledore said. He picked up a lemon drop and turned it over in his fingers. Yes. You'll be in the plan. February, and Quidditch, and the ongoing business of being a student, which Harry found genuinely engaging rather than merely necessary, in the way that people who are curious about everything find formal learning to be a useful scaffold rather than a cage. Neville was better. This was not the kind of better that happens suddenly, with a revelation or a turning point. It was the kind of better that happens in increments, practice by practice, week by week, the way a muscle develops, not with drama but with the quiet accumulation of evidence that you are more capable than the story you've been told about yourself. Harry had been working with him in the evenings. Not tutoring, exactly, tutoring implies a hierarchy that wasn't the operating principle. More like practicing together, with Harry providing the specific adjustments that Neville's technique needed, less anxiety in the grip, more trust in the wand's own responsiveness, the understanding that magical confidence and personal confidence were different things and you could build the former while the latter was still a work in progress. Neville had, it turned out, a natural affinity for herbology that transferred to potions in ways he hadn't recognized because Snape's delivery made potions feel like a performance evaluation rather than a science. When Harry reframed it, when he pointed out that Neville's understanding of plant properties was actually more sophisticated than most of their year group, which was the core knowledge the potions curriculum was built on, something clicked. Neville's grades in potions went from barely passing to solid in 4 weeks, and Snape had looked at his improved work with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction but occupied the territory between. He looked at my potion for a long time, Neville told Harry one evening in the common room. That's good, Harry said. It didn't feel like a good look, Neville said. With Snape, a long look is the good look, Harry said. The bad look is no look at all. Neville considered this. How do you understand him? He said. I've never met anyone who's both brilliant and specifically designed to make you feel terrible. He's not designed to make you feel terrible, Harry said. He's designed to make mediocrity feel uncomfortable. That's different. He paused. He made me feel terrible in exactly one lesson, the first one. Because he came in expecting to encounter something he'd spent a long time preparing to be contemptuous of. When it wasn't there, he stopped. But for everyone else gives him mediocrity, Harry said. Not from lack of ability. From anxiety. And anxiety in a potions classroom does produce mediocrity, which confirms his contempt, which increases the anxiety. He set down his quill. The way to break the loop is to stop caring whether he's contemptuous. Neville was quiet for a moment. That's easy for you, he said. It wasn't accusatory. Just honest. Easier for me, Harry said, which was the true version. Not easy. Neville looked at him. What are you anxious about? He said, with the direct simplicity of someone who genuinely wanted to know, not to score a point. Harry thought about this. About Quirrell's hands steady under his performed panic. About the wards being tested from the other side. About what was coming and the calendar running toward it with the inexorable logic of a sequence that had been in motion since before he was born. That I'll miss something, he said. That the piece I haven't seen yet will be the piece that matters. Neville looked at him steadily. You're less likely to miss things than anyone I've met, he said. That's not reassuring, Harry said. Because the things I've missed aren't the things I could see coming. He went back to his work, and Neville went back to his, and the fire burned down in the grate between them. In March, Harry found out about the second attempt. He'd been doing his twice-daily ward check with the focused attention that had become as automatic as breathing, and he felt it, a pressure, stronger than the previous ones. Not just a test. An attempt. Something had pressed against the ward boundaries with actual force, tested the structural integrity of the first layer, found a specific point and applied a specific counter to it. The ward had held. But the counter had been exactly right for the ward structure, which meant whoever was applying it understood Dumbledore's enchantments in detail, either from long study or from direct experience of how he worked. Harry went to Dumbledore's office that evening without being summoned and found the door already open. Dumbledore was standing at the window looking out at the grounds. He didn't turn when Harry came in. "You felt it," he said. "Third floor west wall," Harry said. "The second layer junction. Someone applied a structured counter to the ward architecture. They know your signature." Dumbledore turned from the window. He looked tired in a way that Harry had not seen before, not physically tired, but the deeper tired of someone who has been holding a weight for a very long time and is no longer entirely sure the holding is sustainable. "The timeline has moved," he said. "Yes," Harry said. "When are you going to move the stone?" "I can't move it," Dumbledore said. "Moving it creates a transit window where it's unprotected. The mirror protection is dependent on its fixed location. It's been anchored to this castle's magical core. Then the protections need to be strengthened," Harry said. "I've been working on that," Dumbledore said. "Since January." "I can help," Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. "Not because I need to be in it," Harry said. "Because Fawkes's fire can be used to reinforce ward boundaries and you know it." He paused. "You know it because you lived with Fawkes for 40 years and you've seen wild phoenix fire now, and the difference between what a bonded domesticated phoenix can do to a ward and what a wild bond can do." "Stop," Dumbledore said. "Not harsh. Something more like, stop." "Yes. I know." He sat down heavily at his desk. "I should have told you this 6 months ago," Dumbledore said. "Yes," Harry said. "I was still trying to manage the situation," Dumbledore said. "Still, calibrating. Deciding how much you needed to know versus how much was safe for you to know." He pressed 2 fingers against his forehead. "It's a difficult habit to break. 40 years is a long time to practice something." "I know," Harry said. "I'm patient." Dumbledore looked up at him. "Are you?" he said. And there was something almost warm in it, the specific warmth of someone who has discovered that the trust they tentatively extended was not misplaced. "I'm patient with things that are moving in the right direction," Harry said. "We're moving in the right direction." They spent 2 hours that evening discussing ward reinforcement, and Dumbledore showed Harry 3 things he'd never seen done with structured enchantments, and Harry showed Dumbledore what the phoenix fire felt like from the inside when it ran through a ward boundary, which left Dumbledore sitting with his hands flat on the desk with the expression of a man who has just heard a piece of music that redefined for him what music could do. When Harry left, Fawkes was on his perch, gold and red and ancient, and as Harry passed he leaned forward and pressed his beak briefly to Harry's temple, not the bonding gesture, not the scar, just a touch. The specific, particular touch of something that has been with you since the beginning and wants you to know it still is. Harry put his hand up and felt the warmth of the feathers under his palm, and for a moment the whole castle felt like it was the same temperature as that, steady, old, burning cleanly. "We're nearly there," Harry said to Fawkes. The phoenix made the sound that was between music and language, the one that said, yes. And then what comes after? Harry thought about the prophecy, which Dumbledore still hadn't told him in full but which he'd been assembling from the edges of the conversations they'd been having, the shape of it, the structure, the weight it carried. He thought about Voldemort and what remained of him, wearing a man as a coat, pressing against wards in the dark like a thought trying to force its way into a waking mind. He thought about what the mirror had shown him, himself, whole, with fire in his eyes. Not what he lacked. What he was. "I know," he said to Fawkes. "I'm ready." He went back to Gryffindor Tower, and the fire in the common room grate welcomed him the way it always did, immediately, fully, without condition, and he sat in his chair and looked at it and let himself feel, just for a moment, the specific gravity of what was coming. Then he picked up his homework and finished it. Chapter 5, Fire and Stone. The thing about knowing something is coming is that the waiting becomes its own kind of work. April turned to May and May moved toward June with the unhurried certainty of a calendar that doesn't care about the things being planned beneath it, and Harry moved through the last weeks of the school year with two layers of attention running simultaneously, the surface layer that attended to exams and Quidditch practice and the comfortable rhythms of a school year winding down, and the deeper layer that watched the third-floor corridor the way you watch a fire you're not entirely sure is contained. The ward checks had become something he and Dumbledore did together now, twice weekly, standing side by side in the corridor on the third floor with their eyes closed and their attention running along the boundary lines of the enchantments. Harry felt the difference each time, the places where he'd added his own reinforcement, thin lines of phoenix fire woven into the existing structure, producing something that Dumbledore had said was unlike anything he'd encountered, not stronger than his own wards in the conventional sense, but cleaner. Less susceptible to the specific degradation that Voldemort's counters had been targeting because the fire burned away attempts to corrupt the structure the same way it burned away anything that didn't belong. The attempts had continued. More frequent now, and more sophisticated, less exploratory, more purposeful. Something behind the planning had shifted from when will the opportunity present itself to I need to create the opportunity. He's running out of time, Harry said, standing in the corridor on a Thursday afternoon in late May, his eyes still closed. He's not testing anymore. That one was a genuine push. I noticed, Dumbledore said, from beside him. How long do we have? Harry said. A pause that told him the answer was not comfortable. Days, Dumbledore said. Perhaps a week. Harry opened his eyes and looked at the door. Have you told McGonagall? Snape? Severus knows. Minerva has been informed that heightened vigilance is required without being told the specific timeline. You should tell her the timeline, Harry said. Dumbledore was quiet. She'll be more useful if she knows what she's actually dealing with, Harry said. Intelligent people working with incomplete information make the wrong kind of decisions. You know this. He looked at Dumbledore. You know this because you've been making the wrong kind of decisions with incomplete information yourself. Dumbledore looked at him with the expression that Harry had come to recognize as the one where something true had landed and was being processed rather than deflected. I'll speak to Minerva tonight, he said. Good, Harry said. And the others need to know. The others, Dumbledore said, with a specific tone that communicated he knew exactly who Harry meant and had views about it. Ron, Hermione, Neville, Harry said. They're already involved. Ron and Hermione were involved before the troll incident confirmed what was happening. Neville's been helping me with the ward mapping for 6 weeks. Harry, they're going to be involved regardless, Harry said. The same argument I made about myself. I'd rather they're involved informed. Dumbledore turned and walked a few steps down the corridor and stood with his hands behind his back, looking at the window at the end of the hall. Outside, the grounds were bright with late May afternoon, students on the lawn, the lake still and silver. A completely ordinary scene that had no idea what was happening inside the building behind it. If anything happens to them, Dumbledore started. Nothing will happen to them, Harry said. Because they'll know what they're doing. He paused. And because I'll be with them. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. He turned back. I sometimes forget, he said, that you are 11 years old. I know, Harry said. I find it more useful not to remind you. Something moved across Dumbledore's face that was very close to a smile, and underneath the smile, something more complicated, the specific expression of a man who keeps being surprised by his own feelings about a situation he thought he'd already fully processed. Tell your friends, he said. Tonight. Harry told them that evening in the corner of the common room that they'd claimed as their own in October, the 4 chairs around the low table near the window that faced the grounds, which had gradually acquired the character of a fixed meeting point the way spaces do when people use them consistently enough. He told them everything. Not the version edited for age appropriateness or the version with the most worrying parts softened. Everything, the stone, Quirrell, Voldemort's fragment, the timeline, the protections, the ward testing. The Phoenix bond and the charms that had been burned away and what both of those things meant for what was coming. He watched their faces as he talked. Ron went through several expressions and arrived, characteristically, at right, so what's the plan? Hermione went still in the way she went still when information was overriding previous assumptions and her brain was running the new data against everything she already knew, a process that took approximately 90 seconds and produced, at the end of it, the specific calm of someone who has caught up and is now ready to move forward. Neville's face was different from both. He'd gone pale at the name Voldemort, not flinching from it but feeling its weight in a way that was personal and specific, and then his jaw had set with the quiet determination of someone who has had a reason to care about something like this for a very long time and has finally been given a place to put that caring. "The protections," Hermione said when Harry finished, her voice precise. 7 of them in sequence. If something happens, if Quirrell gets through the door, someone needs to go in after him. "Yes," Harry said. "And that's us," Ron said. Not a question. "That's us," Harry confirmed. Ron nodded, once, briskly, with the manner of someone signing up for something they've already decided about. "Okay. Walk us through them." So Harry did, and they sat for 2 hours going through each protection, what it was, what it required, what the vulnerability was, how to address it. It was not planning from scratch. Harry had been thinking about this since January and the framework was already built. This was calibrating the team around the framework, assigning the parts that played to specific strengths. Devil's Snare, Hermione, immediately and without discussion, because she knew the botanical counter from magical drafts and potions and had verified it with additional reading 3 weeks ago when Harry had told her the general shape of the chamber sequence. Flying Keys, Ron's eye for patterns combined with Harry flying, because the keys were enchanted to move in a formation that was essentially a puzzle, and Ron processed spatial patterns with the speed of someone who'd grown up playing chess at a high level, and Harry on a broom at speed was more effective than any summoning charm. Chess, Ron. Without hesitation, from all of them simultaneously. Ron looked at them looking at him and said, obviously, with a confidence that was not arrogance but genuine self-knowledge, the kind that comes from being very good at one specific thing and knowing it. "The logic puzzle, Hermione." "And the last chamber," Neville said. "With the mirror." They all looked at Harry. "Me," Harry said. "You shouldn't go in alone," Hermione said immediately. "I won't be," Harry said. He looked at Fawkes, who was not in the room but whose warmth was always present, the specific shape of here that had followed him since October. "But the mirror responds to intent. Whoever goes in that last room, if they have any desire for the stone, any sense that taking it would be useful, for any reason, the mirror reads it. Voldemort can't get the stone because he wants to use it. I can get the stone because I just want to make sure Voldemort doesn't." "That's circular," Hermione said. "It's the design," Harry said. "What happens when you're in the room with whatever Voldemort is?" Neville said quietly. It was the question no one else had asked directly, stated with the blunt honesty that Neville had been developing all year, the voice of someone who has decided that speaking clearly is more useful than speaking carefully. "I deal with it," Harry said. "That's not a plan," Neville said. "It's the honest part of the plan," Harry said. "The rest I can choreograph. That last part depends on what I find when I get there." Neville looked at him steadily. "I'm going to the chess room with you," he said. "And then past it." Harry looked at him. "Neville, I know what he did to my parents," Neville said, with the quality of someone saying something they've been carrying for 11 years and have decided to put down by saying it out loud. "I'm not staying on the other side of a chess room while you go deal with him." Silence around the table. "All right," Harry said. Ron glanced at Neville with the look that Harry had seen Ron give a handful of times, the look of genuine respect, offered quickly and without ceremony, which was more meaningful than any elaborate acknowledgement. Neville didn't see it because he was looking at Harry, but Harry saw it, and made a note of it for later. "One more thing," Harry said. "Dumbledore will be here." Whatever happens in there, he's not out of it, he's the failsafe. If we get into trouble, Fawkes will reach him. He looked around the table. This isn't us against everything alone. We're the point team. Dumbledore's the net. Hermione let out a breath that suggested she'd been holding it since roughly the word Voldemort. That's better, she said. That's considerably better. Yeah, said Ron. Still terrifying, but better. The night it happened was the 7th of June. Harry woke at 2 in the morning with the ward sense blazing. Not the careful, methodical testing he'd been monitoring for weeks. Not a push against a specific structural junction. A breach. Clean and fast and decisive, the kind of break that comes when someone has finished mapping and starts moving, and the difference between the two was so distinct that Harry was out of bed and dressed before he was fully awake, moving on the specific adrenaline of a body that has been waiting for a specific signal and knows it when it hears it. He knocked on Ron's bed curtain once, sharply. Ron sat up with the alertness of someone who'd been sleeping light for 2 weeks. Now? Ron said. Now, Harry said. He was already at the dormitory door. Down to Hermione, he knocked on the girls' staircase door and waited 2 counts and then called her name quietly, and she appeared 30 seconds later fully dressed, her hair still down but her wand in her hand and her bag already over her shoulder because she'd packed it 3 days ago. Neville was behind her, because Neville had apparently been sleeping in the girls' common room armchair, which he'd said he would not do and then done because that was Neville, making the quiet decision and executing it without announcement. Harry looked at all of them. They looked back. Protections first, he said. Fast. They went. The 3rd-floor corridor was wrong immediately, the door that had been locked for 9 months stood open, not forced but unlocked, the wards around it having been dismantled with a precision that Harry felt in his chest like a cold hand. He looked at the state of the enchantments for 2 seconds, understanding the method, and then he went through the door. The smell of the chamber hit them first, damp, old, the underground smell of a space that doesn't get weather. Torches lit along the walls as they entered, triggered by movement, and in the light Harry saw the 3-headed dog across the chamber, all 3 heads lolling, deeply asleep. In front of it, the trapdoor. On the floor near the trapdoor, a harp. Still playing, its strings moving on their own with the enchanted persistence of something set running and left. Someone was here before us, Hermione said. Quirrell, Harry said. He put the harp down to keep Fluffy asleep and went through. We need to move before the music stops. He went to the trapdoor and pulled it open and looked down. Darkness, a long drop, and the sound of something alive and rustling far below. He dropped into it without ceremony. The fall was long enough to be unpleasant and short enough to be survivable. He landed in something soft and dense and immediately began moving. The plant underneath him was Devil's Snare, recognizable by the texture and the way it began to respond to his weight, tendrils starting to curl with the slow purposefulness of something that feeds. Hermione, he called upward. She landed beside him. She had her wand out before she'd steadied herself, and the bluebell flames she conjured were precise and immediate, spreading in a contained ring that made the Devil's Snare retreat with an urgency that was almost dignified. The path forward opened cleanly. Ron and Neville came through in quick succession. Ron landed on his feet. Neville landed on Ron, which produced a brief moment of genuine comedy that was completely at odds with the situation and that everyone processed and discarded in approximately 1 second because there were more pressing things. The key chamber was enormous, lit by its own enchanted light, thousands of keys in the air above them in a formation that shifted constantly, a living puzzle, the kind that requires you to look at the whole system rather than any individual component. At the far end, a locked door. At one side of the room, 4 brooms. I can see the right one, Ron said immediately. He'd been looking at the formation for 5 seconds with the focused stillness of someone for whom spatial pattern recognition is as natural as breathing. There, the one with the bent wing, 3rd layer, moving counterclockwise to the main formation. It's the odd one out. The others are a decoy pattern. Which side does it go to? Harry said, already at a broom. It's going to cross left in about 8 seconds, Ron said. Go left and high. Harry was in the air. He went left and high and he didn't look at the swarm, he looked at the specific key Ron had identified, and he reached it in 4 seconds and closed his hand around it and felt the lock of the door below respond, a click he heard from 20 feet in the air because the chamber's magic amplified it. He came down and they went through the door. The chess room stopped them for a moment in a way none of the others had, not because it was more threatening, but because it was more complete. The scale of it. The pieces, each one taller than a person, standing in silent formation on a board of black and white squares that stretched to the limits of torchlight. On the other side of the board, another door. And on the near side, evidence of someone's recent passage, 2 pieces destroyed, the path of the crossing visible in the formation of what remained. Ron looked at the board for a long time. 30 seconds. No one spoke. Quirrell took the direct path, Ron said. He was in a hurry and he had power, so he just forced through. The formation is still responding to the crossing. It's reconfigured around the gap. He tilted his head. Which means the pieces are in a defensive posture, not an offensive one. They're guarding rather than attacking. Can we get through? Neville said. We can get through differently, Ron said. Not force, position. He moved forward and stood at the edge of the first square and studied the whole board in the same silence. We need to sacrifice the bishop's pawn early. If we do that, the entire defensive formation rotates and there's a path through the left flank that the pieces can't cover. He looked back. Harry, I need you to play the knight. Center left position. Do exactly what I tell you. Are any of us going to get hurt? Harry said. Ron's face did something honest and uncomfortable. Maybe, he said. Tell me who, Harry said. Ron looked at the board again. His jaw was set with the same quality as Neville's in the common room, the voice of someone who has worked something out and is going to say it plainly. I need to be the rook, he said. The rook takes the damage in this configuration. There isn't another way through that's faster. Harry looked at him. Ron, it's not fatal damage, Ron said. I know what I'm looking at. The rook gets hit but not destroyed. I'll be knocked out, probably. He looked completely composed, which was its own kind of courage, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that shouts, but the quiet kind that does the math and accepts the answer. That's the trade. Neville said, then I stay with you. Ron started to argue. Neville cut him off with a look that was gentler than the words he didn't say but communicated them clearly. You stayed with me, back in September, with the boat and Trevor, without being asked. Shut up. Hermione, can you get to the logic puzzle without me? Harry said. Yes, she said immediately. Ron, take the position, Harry said. Ron nodded. He walked to the rook square with the careful, deliberate step of someone who has decided something and is moving into it without second-guessing. He looked back once. Don't lose, he said, to Harry, and it was half Quidditch and half something else, the language of a friendship that had built itself very fast and very solidly over 9 months and had enough structure now to hold weight. I won't, Harry said. The game took 8 minutes. Harry played the knight exactly as Ron directed, watching Ron's instructions come across the board in the specific shorthand of someone running a system they understand completely, not naming the moves but calling the logic, and Harry following it the way you follow someone through a landscape they know better than you do. When the rook's piece moved into position and the opposing queen's piece struck, Ron fell. He hit the board with the kind of impact that looked terrible and was, Harry had to trust, the kind that looked worse than it was. Neville was beside him before anyone else moved. Harry crossed the last 3 squares alone. The logic puzzle was a row of 7 bottles, each containing a different liquid, with a poem on the table that described the sequence of properties that would allow you to identify the safe potion. Hermione read the poem once, studied the bottles for 90 seconds with the focused attention of someone who reads ingredient density and magical signature as fluently as text, and then pointed at the smallest bottle without hesitation. "Forward," she said. "And Harry, this one, 4 back." She indicated a rounded bottle at the right end. "There's only enough for one person going forward. Take it." "You go back," Harry said. "Get Ron and Neville out when they can move. Tell Dumbledore." "Already planning to," Hermione said. She looked at him across the row of bottles with those sharp, precise eyes that missed nothing and had been missing nothing since the first conversation on the lake. "Harry." She paused. "I know you can handle what's in there. I'm not worried about that." Another pause. "Just, come back." It was simple. It was the right thing to say. "I'll come back," Harry said. He picked up the small bottle and drank it. He stepped through the black fire and into the last chamber. The room was lit by a different quality of light than the chambers before it, not torchlight, not enchanted light, but something older and more ambient, the sourceless illumination of a space where significant magic had been resident for a long time. The mirror stood at the center, enormous, its gold frame catching nothing because there was nothing to catch, no torch, no window. It seemed to generate its own dull gleam from somewhere inside the glass. In front of the mirror, Professor Quirrell. He was standing very still, looking into the glass, and his expression was the most revealing Harry had seen on him all year, not the performed panic, not the careful stutter, but something stripped, raw, the look of a man who has been hollowed out and filled with something else and has almost forgotten the difference between the two. He'd been here for some time. His hands were at his sides and trembling slightly. He turned when Harry came through the black fire. "Potter," he said. His voice was different here, steadier, with the stutter entirely absent. The voice of a man who has run out of the energy required to maintain the performance. "Professor Quirrell," Harry said. "You really came." He looked at Harry with something that was not quite curiosity and not quite admiration. "He said you would. He said the boy would follow, that we'd have to deal with him." A pause. "I thought perhaps you wouldn't." Harry looked at the mirror and then back at Quirrell. "What do you see in it?" he said. Quirrell's face did something complex. "Myself," he said, with a bitterness that was both his and not his, the specific bitterness of a man who had wanted to be exceptional and had instead become a vehicle for someone else's exceptionalism. "Myself, presenting him the stone. But the mirror won't give it to me." He turned back to the glass. "He says you'll be able to get it. That you're different from the others." "He's right," Harry said. "But probably not in the way he means." The temperature in the room dropped. It was not subtle. It was the specific, total drop of something very large drawing power inward, the magical equivalent of a deep breath before speech. The shadows at the back of the room deepened, and from those deepened shadows came something that wasn't light and wasn't dark but occupied the space between them with the awful confidence of something that has been in that space for a very long time. "Harry Potter." The voice it was not Quirrell's voice. It came from Quirrell's mouth the way a recording comes from a device. The vibration was human but the thing producing it was not. It was cold and precise and it had an expressiveness that was somehow worse for its control, the voice of something that feels everything and chooses to display nothing. "Step forward," the voice said. Harry didn't move. "You've come all this way," the voice said, with what might have been amusement if amusement were possible in something that had spent decades reducing itself to will. "Through Dumbledore's clever traps. Through the old man's chess pieces. I had wondered whether you were a threat or an asset. Looking at you now," a pause. "I confess I'm uncertain. That is an unusual experience." "I'll bet it is," Harry said. Quirrell turned. The motion was jerky, wrong, not Quirrell directing his body but something else directing it, and the wrongness of it was the kind that takes a moment to fully land, the precise horror of a person being used as furniture. The back of Quirrell's turban was facing Harry now, and then with a sound that Harry would spend a long time trying not to remember clearly, the turban unwound. On the back of Quirrell's head, Voldemort's face. Not the face from the paintings in the history books, the handsome, cold-eyed Tom Riddle. This was something past that, something the decades of division and dark magic had worked on until what was left was barely a face in the human sense, more the memory of a face, a chalk outline of one. Pale past white, the eyes red, and in those eyes something that Harry recognized because he'd felt it in the edges of things all year, the feeling of being assessed with complete, unilateral intention by something that had no consideration for anything except the object of its attention. "The boy who survived," Voldemort said. His eyes moved to Harry's scar. "Curious. I looked for you, you know. After. I spent years looking. The old man hid you well." The eyes lifted to Harry's. "But you found your way here regardless. That is either fate or character. I find myself hoping it is character." "Why?" Harry said. "Because character can be, a pause, deliberate. Redirected. Fate cannot." Harry looked at the face on the back of Quirrell's head without looking away. He'd been afraid of this moment in the abstract, in the distant future way you're afraid of things that haven't happened yet but that you can see coming. Now that it was here, the fear was smaller than the abstract version had been, and underneath it was something cleaner and more useful, clarity. The specific clarity of someone who knows exactly what they're looking at and what it means. "I'm going to get the stone out of that mirror," Harry said. "And I'm going to make sure you don't get it. And then whatever is left after that, we'll deal with." The red eyes narrowed. "You cannot stop me, child." "I know you think that," Harry said. "You've been thinking it since Godric's Hollow and you're still here on the back of someone else's head." He kept his voice even. "I'm not trying to stop you with power. I'm trying to stop you with the mirror. Which doesn't care about power." He turned to the mirror and stepped toward it. Quirrell moved to block him, or Voldemort moved Quirrell, the motion too fast and too wrong to be voluntary, and Harry felt the force of a curse hit the air next to his shoulder, close enough to disturb his hair. He stepped to the side and kept walking. Another curse. Harry dropped, rolled, came up still moving toward the mirror. He wasn't running, running was the wrong energy for this, scattered and reactive. He was moving, which was different, with the specific directional purpose of someone who has already decided where they're going. The warmth at the edge of his awareness blazed up. Fawkes came through the black fire behind him. Not quietly. There is nothing quiet about a phoenix entering a room in full fire, the flame that is not destructive but consuming, consuming darkness, consuming the enchanted cold, consuming the specific ambient wrongness of a space that has been in proximity to Voldemort's fragment. The room blazed gold and red and the sourceless ambient light became something brilliant and immediate, and Quirrell stumbled back from the mirror, shielding Voldemort's face with his hand. Harry put his hand on the mirror's frame. He looked into the glass. His reflection looked back at him, himself, green-eyed, steady, with the phoenix fire visible in the green of his eyes, gold and warm and entirely at home. He watched himself reach into the pocket of his robe in the reflection. His hand closed around something in the reflected pocket. And then he felt it in the actual pocket, real, solid, warm. Smooth and small and unimaginably dense with potential. The stone. He closed his fingers around it. The mirror's surface rippled once and went still. Behind him, Voldemort screamed. It was not a sound for unpacking in real time. Harry put it away for later and held the stone in his fist and turned. Quirrell was reaching for him. His hands locked around Harry's wrist before Harry could step back, and then something happened that neither of them had planned for. Where Quirrell's skin met Harry's, fire erupted. Not the phoenix fire, not warm, not selective. Something older and more reflexive, pouring out of Harry's skin the way water pours when a vessel breaks, burning with the specific heat of something that had been held back and was no longer held back. Quirrell screamed. His grip didn't break. Harry felt the pain of it, his wrist, his hand, the fire burning outward from contact with something that Voldemort's presence in Quirrell had made fundamentally wrong, and he gritted his teeth and kept his grip on the stone and did not move. Fawkes landed on his shoulder. The Phoenix fire and the contact fire merged and ran through Harry with a heat that was absolute and clean, and Quirrell's hands fell away. The defense professor collapsed. Harry staggered. He caught himself with one hand on the mirror's frame and stood breathing, his wrist burning, the stone warm in his closed fist. He looked down at Quirrell, who was on the ground, and what he saw made him turn away, not from horror but from something more complicated, the specific look of a man being released from something terrible at the same time as he was being destroyed by it. At the back of Quirrell's head, Voldemort's face was moving. The mouth was shaping words, curses, or something past curses, and the red eyes were blazing with the specific, furnace-bright rage of something that has just watched absolute certainty become absolute failure. This isn't, the voice, breaking now, losing its control. You're just a child, yes, Harry said. I am. He held out his free hand toward Fawkes. The Phoenix stepped from his shoulder onto his arm with the weight of something ancient and entirely real, and Harry felt the warmth run through the bond with the specific quality of, I'm here. I've always been here. Now. The fire that came from them was not a weapon. Weapons are shaped toward things. This was simply, light. The light of something honest and old burning clean in a space that had been cold for a long time, and the thing Voldemort's spirit was could not abide honesty, could not abide warmth, had spent decades making itself the exact opposite of both those qualities, and where the light touched the fragment, dispersed. It was not dramatic. There was no explosion, no theatrical death cry. The thing that had been Voldemort's spirit left the dying body of Quirrell the way smoke leaves a room when the window opens, thinning, becoming translucent, losing its coherence. The cold in the room retreated in stages, and the ambient light normalized, and Fawkes's fire burned on, steady and certain, until the last trace of cold was gone. Quirrell was dead. Harry stood in the silence of the chamber and held the stone and felt, tired. The specific, profound tired of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just put it down, and their body hasn't yet updated to the new condition. His wrist hurt badly where Quirrell had grabbed it. His head was ringing from something, possibly the last curse or possibly just the sustained intensity of the last 20 minutes. He looked at Fawkes. Fawkes looked back at him with those bright, ancient eyes. Thank you, Harry said. Fawkes made the sound. I know, Harry said. You don't need thanks. He closed his eyes for a moment. But still. He opened them and looked at the stone in his hand. Smooth, deep red, the color of the center of a fire. He could feel its density, centuries of Nicholas Flamel's work, the anchor point of 2 lives, an object that was simultaneously the most valuable thing most wizards could imagine and the source of the danger that had just been, for now, resolved. He closed his fingers around it. The door behind him opened. Dumbledore came through the black fire with his wand out and his robes moving with the speed of someone who had not been walking slowly. He took in the room in the quick, comprehensive way of someone whose mind processes scenes rather than details first, and he went still. He looked at Quirrell. He looked at Harry. He looked at Fawkes on Harry's arm. He looked at Harry's closed fist. Are you hurt? He said. First. Before anything else. The question of someone who had decided, sometime in the last several months, what the priority was. My wrist, Harry said. And my head a bit. Nothing serious. Dumbledore crossed the room to him and looked at the wrist with a quick diagnostic that produced a small, pained expression when he saw the burns. He drew his wand and cast something gentle and precise. The pain reduced immediately, not gone but managed. Your friends, Harry said. Minerva has them, Dumbledore said. They're safe. Ron will have a significant headache and some bruising. Neville has a twisted ankle. Hermione is entirely uninjured and has been telling Minerva what happened in a level of detail I suspect Minerva is finding both impressive and alarming. His eyes moved to Harry's fist. The stone? Harry opened his hand. Dumbledore looked at the stone for a long moment. His face was the face of a man feeling a great many things simultaneously and choosing to feel them rather than manage them, which Harry had come to understand was the harder thing. "Thank you," he said. "It was in the mirror," Harry said. "The protection worked." "Yes," Dumbledore said. He looked up from the stone. "You should have the conversation with Nicholas. He'll want to know." "What do you mean?" Harry said. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "Nicholas is very old, Harry. Very, very old. And he's been thinking, for some years now, about what enough means." He said it carefully, with the weight of a man who has had this conversation already, in private, with himself and with Nicholas Flamel. About whether a life extended beyond its natural length is the same thing as a life fully lived. Harry looked at the stone. Thought about Flamel, a man who'd had 600 years, who had outlived every friend and context and era that had given his life its original meaning. The stone was the reason Voldemort had come. The stone was, in that sense, the problem. But the stone also belonged to Nicholas Flamel, and what happened to it was Nicholas Flamel's decision. "He'll know what to do with it," Harry said. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "I believe he will." Harry handed him the stone. Dumbledore took it with both hands, holding it as you'd hold something borrowed rather than something owned. Fawkes sang. Not the phrase of sound that meant here, not the communication between the two of them. An actual song, one full phrase of real phoenix music, filling the chamber from stone to stone, making the air vibrate with something that was both beautiful and deeply, specifically sad, the way things are sad when they're over and they were good while they lasted. The sound washed through the chamber and through the stone and upward through the castle, and Harry would learn later that students sleeping in dormitories heard it in their dreams and woke briefly and felt, without understanding why, that something had been resolved. Harry stood in the last chamber of the protection sequence with the headmaster of Hogwarts and an ancient phoenix and the cooling body of a professor who had been more victim than villain, and he felt the exhaustion fully, completely, without trying to manage it. "Can we go up?" he said. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "I think we've been down here long enough." They went back through the black fire together, and Harry didn't look at Quirrell again, and the phoenix flew ahead of them through the chambers, lighting the way. Chapter 6. What burns away the hospital wing at Hogwarts smelled like lavender and something antiseptic that Madame Pomfrey had been brewing for so long it had become indistinguishable from the building itself. Harry woke up in it the morning after the chambers with the specific disorientation of someone who has slept too deeply and too long and come back to consciousness in a location that isn't where they fell asleep. He lay still for a moment and listened. Breathing, from his left, 2 people, the steady rhythm of sleep. Birds outside the high windows. The distant, muffled sound of the castle doing its morning business 2 floors below. And underneath all of it, the warmth at the edge of his awareness, constant and unwavering, the specific quality of here that had been the most reliable thing in his life since before he could form a memory of it. He turned his head left. Ron was in the next bed, asleep on his back with his mouth slightly open and one arm hanging off the edge of the mattress in the abandoned way of someone sleeping without self-consciousness. 2 beds down, Neville was a shape under blankets with only the top of his head visible, his ankle presumably elevated under some arrangement of pillows. Between them, Hermione was in a chair rather than a bed. She hadn't been injured, and Harry suspected she'd refused a bed on principle and had been allowed the chair as a compromise, with a book open on her lap and her head tilted back and her eyes closed, clearly having fallen asleep reading sometime in the night. Harry watched them for a moment. He thought about the chess board and Ron stepping into the rook's position with the deliberate, uncomplaining courage of someone who has done the math and accepted the answer. He thought about Neville in the doorway of the common room saying "I know what he did to my parents" with 11 years of weight behind it and a jaw set with something that had nothing to do with being ready and everything to do with choosing to go anyway. He thought about Hermione looking at him across the logic puzzle saying just come back with the specific compression of someone who had a great deal more to say and chose the most important thing. He thought, I have never had friends before this year. And then, more carefully, no. That's not exactly right. I have had good people in my life. What I have never had until this year is people who know what I am and are here anyway. The difference between those two things is significant. He sat up. His wrist was bandaged and his head had the dull, receded ache of something that had been worse and had been dealt with. He felt, not fine, exactly. Wrung out. The specific emptiness of something that has run at full intensity for a long time and has been turned off. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his hands and thought about the stone and Quirrell and the thing that had been Voldemort's face saying you're just a child and the voice of someone for whom that fact should have settled the question. He'd thought about that line several times already, in the fragments between sleeping. The specific contempt in it. And then, underneath the contempt, something more interesting, the genuine surprise. Not performative. Actual surprise, from something that did not surprise easily, at the specific quality of what it had found when it looked directly at Harry Potter. He filed this away. Not as pride. As information. Madame Pomfrey appeared from her office with the expression of a woman who had been expecting this and was prepared. Awake, she said. Good. How is the head? Better, Harry said. The wrist will need another day, she said, looking at the bandaging with the critical attention of a craftsperson assessing their own work. The burns were significant but clean. You were lucky. I had help, Harry said. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was more complex than her usual brisk professionalism, something that acknowledged, briefly, that she knew more about what had happened last night than her role required her to know, and that the knowing had moved her. Yes, she said. You did. She handed him a potion that tasted like cold copper and left a spreading warmth behind it. Breakfast will be brought up. Don't try to go downstairs before noon. The headmaster has been informed you're awake, she said. He'll be by when he's ready. He had a very long night too. She moved to check on Ron, who was stirring. Harry watched her go and then looked at the window and the bright June morning beyond it, the grounds washed clean by what must have been overnight rain, the lake still and silver bright in the early sun. He breathed. Ron woke up with a headache and an immediate request for food, which Madame Pomfrey met with a tray and a look that combined sympathy with firm instructions about sitting upright. He looked at Harry across the space between their beds and said, You got it, then. We got it, Harry said. Ron considered this with the expression of someone taking an honest inventory. I played chess, he said. And then I got knocked out and Neville babysat me. You made it possible, Harry said. Without the chess room there's no getting to the last chamber in time. Everything downstream of that was downstream of you. Ron absorbed this with the slightly uncomfortable expression of someone who has been raised in a large family and is not entirely sure what to do with direct credit. Still, he said. You're the one who went in at the end. Yes, Harry said. Was it? Ron started, and then stopped, and rephrased. How bad was it? Harry thought about it honestly. Not as bad as it would have been without preparation, he said. Worse than I told Dumbledore at the time, probably. He looked at his bandaged wrist. Quirrell is dead. Ron went quiet. He looked at his hands on the blanket. He was a person, he said. Before whatever happened to him. Yes, Harry said. He was. They sat with that in the way you sit with things that are true and uncomfortable and don't resolve neatly, which is the only honest way to sit with them. Neville woke up next, surfacing from the blankets with the cautious optimism of someone checking whether a thing that happened last night was real or a dream. When he established it was real, he sat up and looked at Harry with those steady eyes and said nothing for a moment. Your ankle. Harry said. Fine, Neville said. Madame Pomfrey fixed it last night. A pause. I heard the phoenix. In the chamber. From outside the door. He looked at Harry. I've never heard anything like that. No, Harry said. Most people haven't. It sounded like, Neville paused, reaching for the right word. It sounded like something being set right. Harry looked at him. Yes, he said. That's exactly what it sounded like. Hermione woke up 40 minutes later, jerking awake with the expression of someone who had not intended to fall asleep and was consequently running an immediate internal check on what she'd missed. She looked at Harry, looked at the book still open on her lap, looked at the time on the small clock on the bedside table, and said, "It's 9 in the morning. I've been asleep for 4 hours. That's unacceptable." You needed sleep, Harry said. I needed to be awake when you woke up, she said. I only woke up 20 minutes ago. She looked at him with the specific expression she kept for moments when his logic was technically correct but beside the point. Then, as if the argument had been settled, "Are you all right?" "Getting there," Harry said. She crossed to his bed and sat in the chair beside it and looked at his wrist and then at his face with the quick, comprehensive assessment she gave things she was worried about. Then she seemed to decide that the assessment was satisfactory and she relaxed, fractionally, the way a person relaxes when they've been bracing for something and it hasn't come. "Quirrell," she said. "Dead," Harry said. She nodded, once. "And, the other thing? What was in Quirrell?" "Gone," Harry said. "For now." "For now," she repeated. "It wasn't destroyed," Harry said. "It was dispersed. It can't be destroyed like that." He kept his voice even and factual, which was the tone that worked best for information that was genuinely frightening, not minimizing it, but not dramatizing it either. "It exists somewhere. It'll find another way, eventually. But not soon." Hermione absorbed this in silence. "Then, we need to talk about next year." Ron made a sound from his bed. "Hermione, we're in a hospital wing. Next year will come regardless of where we are right now," Hermione said, without particular sharpness, because she wasn't being argumentative. She was being a person who processes fear by making plans. "She's right," Harry said. "But later today. Give it until afternoon." Hermione looked at him. Then she opened her book and found her place. Dumbledore came at 11. He came alone, without the professional warmth he wore in public the way most people wear good clothes. He looked older than he usually looked, which Harry recognized as the specific look of someone who had been awake for a long time dealing with the aftermath of serious events, the negotiations, the ministry owls, the explanations, the decisions about what got reported and what got handled quietly. He pulled up a chair and sat down beside Harry's bed and for a moment he just sat, with his hands on his knees, in the particular silence of someone who has several things to say and is deciding the order. Ron and Neville and Hermione were quiet. Harry appreciated this about them, the understanding that some conversations needed space. "Nicholas has been informed," Dumbledore said. "He and Perenelle are well. The stone is with me for the moment, and Nicholas and I have spoken about its future." He paused. "He's decided to destroy it." The word landed quietly. "His choice," Harry said. "His and Perenelle's, yes. They've been thinking about it for some time." Dumbledore looked at his hands. "They have had a great deal of time to think about most things." Nicholas said, a pause. He said that he had been afraid to let go of something he'd spent so long building, and that fear of loss had kept him holding something past the point where holding it was serving either him or the world. The old wizard was quiet for a moment. "I found that more personally relevant than I expected." Harry looked at him. "The ministry," he said. "What did you tell them?" "As little as I could without lying outright," Dumbledore said. He met Harry's gaze with the directness that had developed between them over the last several months. An incident involving a compromised member of staff who had been possessed by a dark entity, now resolved. The entity has been dispersed. There will be questions. About me, Harry said. About all of you, Dumbledore said. He looked at the four of them in turn. The minister will want to speak with you individually before the end of term. I would suggest, he paused. I would suggest you be honest about the facts and say very little about the specific nature of the things you experienced. The ministry is not, currently, equipped to hear certain things without responding in ways that would be counterproductive. Counterproductive to what? Hermione said. To the actual preparation required for what's coming, Dumbledore said. He said it plainly, the way Harry had come to appreciate him saying things, without softening, but also without drama. Voldemort will return. Not this year, not next, but the timeline is not as long as most people would prefer to believe. The wizarding world as a whole has spent the last decade pretending otherwise, and I have allowed that pretense to continue when I should have been insisting on honesty. The room was quiet. So what do we do? Neville said. Dumbledore looked at him. The look he gave Neville was different from the look he'd given the others. There was something specific in it, something that had been working its way toward the surface all year, and that Harry had been waiting to see come out. I believe, Neville, Dumbledore said carefully, that we start by making sure that everyone in this room has access to everything they need to be actually prepared, rather than managed. Neville held his gaze steadily. My parents, he said. Do you know who? Yes, Dumbledore said. I know the names of everyone responsible for what happened to your parents. When you want that conversation, I'll have it with you. Neville said nothing. His jaw was doing the thing. He nodded. The headmaster left an hour later and the four of them sat in the hospital wing in the midday light and talked, and the talking was different from any conversation Harry had had in this room or most rooms, not about the events exactly, but about what the events meant and what came next, the way people talk when something significant has closed and the space after it is still open. Ron said, Can we acknowledge that we just did that? We actually did that. We did it because we were prepared, Hermione said. We did it because we didn't treat it like something we weren't supposed to be part of, Harry said. That was the difference. The chess room was real, though, Ron said, with the particular satisfaction of someone revisiting a performance they're genuinely proud of. That was legitimately good chess. It was extraordinary chess, Harry said. It was, Hermione confirmed, and from Hermione this was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Ron looked pleased in a way that was comfortable with itself, not reaching for more than it was. Neville was good too, he said. With the staying. Someone had to make sure you didn't lie there being unconscious indefinitely, Neville said, with more dryness than any of them had heard from him before this year. It landed well. Ron grinned. Harry listened to them and felt the warmth that had nothing to do with Fawkes, the warmth that was just, this. These specific people in this specific light on this specific morning, all of them having come through something and come out the other side intact, sitting together in the way of people who have earned the comfort of each other's company. He thought, this is what the mirror showed me. Not a moment like this, I hadn't had this yet when I looked at it. But the capacity for it. The being whole enough that there was room for this. That was the thing the mirror had seen and reflected back. He didn't say this out loud. Some things were better held quietly. The afternoon brought the exam results, which were posted with the cheerful institutional indifference of a bureaucracy that doesn't pause for dramatic events. Hermione had the highest marks in the year across 7 subjects, which surprised no one. Harry was second in 5 subjects and first in 2, defense against the dark arts, which felt like it had a specific kind of irony to it, and charms, which didn't. Ron was middle of the table in most things and genuinely exceptional in magical history and strategic theory, the latter of which was an elective that most students didn't bother with and which McGonagall had apparently been pressing the ministry to make compulsory for years. Neville had passed everything, including potions, which he'd shared with Harry in a look that lasted about half a second and contained a complete conversation. Madame Pomfrey discharged them before dinner, with instructions about the wrist that Harry listened to carefully because Madame Pomfrey's instructions were the kind that came from real expertise and deserved to be followed. He walked out of the hospital wing into the corridor and stood for a moment while the others moved ahead toward the great hall. The castle around him was doing its evening thing, the light going gold through the west-facing windows, dust moving in the shafts of it, the sound of hundreds of students heading toward dinner carried through the stone from several floors below. Old, familiar, warm with the specific warmth of a place that has been lived in by generations of people all doing the same things at the same times for hundreds of years until the repetition becomes indistinguishable from character. He felt it differently than he had in September. Not as a new place, as a known one. As somewhere that was, in a way that the house on Privet Drive had never been and that the Dursleys' careful management of his smallness had been designed to prevent him from finding his. He thought about Dumbledore and the charms and the 11 years of careful architecture that had been designed to produce a specific kind of person, anxious, needy, grateful for direction, unlikely to question authority, likely to sacrifice himself because he'd been raised to believe his own survival was the least important thing about him. He thought about what he might have been, walking into this castle in September, if Fawkes hadn't come. He thought about this without anger. He'd examined the anger, it was real, it was legitimate, it had a proper shape and a proper weight, and he'd let it be real and legitimate and then he'd set it somewhere he could come back to it without it running him. Anger at Dumbledore was a reasonable response to specific facts about what Dumbledore had done. Rage at Dumbledore was another thing, the kind that metastasizes and fills space needed for other things. Harry had no interest in rage. What he had instead was clarity, and the clarity was this: Dumbledore had made specific choices from specific fears, and those fears had been real, and the choices had been wrong, and the wrongness had not been cancelled out by the reality of the fears. All of those things were true simultaneously. You didn't have to resolve them. He started walking toward the Great Hall. 2 days before the end of term, Harry went back to Dumbledore's office. Fawkes was on his perch. The office was full of its instruments and portraits and the particular quality of light that came through the windows in the late afternoon, and Dumbledore was at his desk and looked up when Harry came in with the expression of someone who had been expecting this visit and had been preparing for it. "Sit down, Harry," he said. Harry sat. For a moment they just looked at each other, in the specific way that had developed between them over the course of the year, direct, honest, without the preliminary negotiations that most conversations required. Harry had come to understand that Dumbledore was more comfortable with this than he'd initially appeared. The careful management had been a habit, not a preference. Underneath it, he was a person who preferred the real conversation, and who had spent so long in a position that made real conversations difficult that he'd built extensive architectural support for avoiding them. Harry had been dismantling that architecture piece by piece since October. "The prophecy," Harry said. Dumbledore held his gaze for a moment, and then he reached into a drawer and placed something on the desk between them. A small, glass sphere, glowing with a faint inner light, the kind of light that has been lit for so long it's become self-sustaining. "This is a copy," Dumbledore said. Sybil Trelawney made the original prediction in 1980 and it was overheard, partially, by someone who should not have been present. That partial information reached Voldemort and set the events of October 1981 in motion. He paused. "I want to tell you the full version. Not because I have authority over when you receive it, I've come to understand that I don't. But because you deserve to hear it from me, in full, rather than in pieces you've assembled from what I've let slip." Harry looked at the sphere. "All right," he said. Dumbledore spoke the prophecy. The sphere responded to the words, the light inside it shifting, and a second voice emerged, Trelawney's, the recorded version, the one that had been made in the moment and carried the specific weight of something spoken rather than composed, the one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies. And the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, but he will have power the Dark Lord knows not, and either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord will be born as the 7th month dies. The sphere's light settled and went quiet. Harry sat with it. The power he knows not, Harry said. Yes, Dumbledore said. I've spent considerable time thinking about what that means. I had a theory for a long time. He paused. I've revised it. Love, Harry said. Your original theory was love. The ancient magic from my mother's sacrifice. Yes, Dumbledore said. And I still believe that was part of it. What she did for you, the protection it created, the reason Voldemort's curse rebounded, that was real and it matters. He was quiet for a moment. But looking at you, Harry, watching you this year, I think I had the right general category and the wrong specific instance. Harry waited. Love is the power he doesn't know, Dumbledore said. But Lily's sacrifice was the first expression of it. The Phoenix bond is another. What you and Fawkes have, what it's done to your perception, your clarity, your ability to see through things, that's not separate from love. It's what love looks like when it hasn't been interfered with. When it's free to be its actual shape. Harry looked at Fawkes. The Phoenix was very still on his perch, looking back with those amber eyes that were older than the castle around them. Voldemort doesn't understand it, Harry said. Not because he's never encountered it. Because he chose, specifically and repeatedly, to move away from it. Every choice that made him what he is was a choice away from that. Yes, Dumbledore said. Which means the prophecy isn't about power in the way he thinks it is, Harry said. He was looking for the stronger spell, the better technique, the way to overpower what protected me. But the thing he can't beat isn't a protection. It's a quality. Yes, Dumbledore said again, and there was something in his voice that was very close to the sound of someone setting something down, a weight he'd been carrying with one interpretation and had just found a better way to hold. And the end of it, Harry said. Neither can live while the other survives. He said it without hesitation, the way you say something you've already made your peace with. That part is still literal. I believe so, Dumbledore said. All right, Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him. All right, he repeated. That's all? What would you like me to say? Harry said. Panic? Rage? I've read the prophecy from its shape for most of this year. The confirmation doesn't change the fact. He held Dumbledore's gaze. What changes is that now we're both working from the same information. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, the charms, he said. I want to revisit this properly. Not as an apology, I've already apologized and I don't think repeating it serves either of us. But as an accounting. He looked at his hands. I placed the first 3 when you were born, before I had reason to think you'd be anyone except the child of 2 people I cared about who were in danger. That's true. The others accumulated over the following years, each one placed for a reason that seemed sufficient at the time. What reasons? Harry said. Dumbledore answered him. He listed them, not quickly, not defensively, but with the specific deliberateness of a man who has decided that honesty means honesty about the things that are hardest to say. The monitoring charms had started as welfare checks, genuinely, because he'd worried about Harry's safety with the Dursleys. They'd grown because the data they returned made him anxious about whether Harry would be the right kind of person, resilient but not defiant, brave but not ungovernable, capable but not independent. Ungovernable, Harry repeated. Yes, Dumbledore said. He said it with the specific flatness of someone acknowledging something that sounds, in the saying, significantly worse than it did in the original thinking. You wanted to make sure I'd do what you needed me to do, Harry said. I wanted to make sure you'd be able to do what I believed needed to be done, Dumbledore said. At the time, I felt that was a meaningful distinction. Is it? Harry said. A long silence. No, Dumbledore said. Not in practice. The outcome is the same. The outcome is 73 charms placed on a child without consent, shaping the development of a person in ways that serve my vision of what they needed to be. He looked up. I justified it with the prophecy. With the stakes. With the absolutely sincere belief that I knew better. He paused. I think that last one is the one worth examining most carefully. Because it's the least visible. Stakes and prophecy are external. The belief that one knows better than the people one is making decisions for, that lives inside, and it's much harder to see. Harry was quiet for a moment. He looked at Fawkes, who was looking at Dumbledore with an expression that Harry had learned to read as, there. That's the thing. I accept the apology, Harry said. I accepted it in the library in December. I want you to know it was accepted then, and the accounting now doesn't change it. It completes it. He paused. But I also want you to understand that I'm telling you this because I want a working relationship with you, not because I need your management. What happened this year worked because you eventually stopped managing and started consulting. I need that to be the permanent arrangement. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light was going golden behind him, the instruments on his shelves catching it and throwing it back in small brilliant points. I will try, he said. I will do better than try. But I want to be honest, old habits in someone as old as I am are formidable. I may slip. And when I do, I would rather you tell me directly than navigate around it. That I can do, Harry said. They sat in that for a moment. On his perch, Fawkes shifted and settled his wings, and the small sounds of the movement were comfortable in the space between them. There's something I want to ask you, Harry said. About the cloak. Dumbledore's eyebrows moved fractionally. It was my father's, Harry said. You held it. For years. Yes, Dumbledore said. Why? Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Because it is an extraordinary object, he said. And because he stopped. Curious about it. The cloak is not merely a very good invisibility cloak, Harry. The fabric is Deathly Hallows in classification, one of 3 objects of legend. I borrowed it from James years before his death, ostensibly to study it. I kept it because, he paused again, and the pause had the texture of a man being honest about something he's been slightly dishonest with himself about for a long time. I kept it because there is a part of me, even now, even knowing what I know, that is still looking for things that don't exist. Things that would make the weight of the decisions I've made easier to bear. The Hallows, Harry said. He'd read about them. Found the book in the restricted adjacent section of the library in November and read it twice and filed it alongside the other long-term information. You were trying to find all 3. Once, Dumbledore said. A long time ago. I was a different kind of certain then. He looked at his hands, his right hand, specifically, at the old scarring there that Harry had never asked about. Certainty costs things. Sometimes the things it costs belong to other people. Harry looked at the scarring. Didn't ask. Stored it. I'm glad you sent the cloak, he said. It's mine. Yes, Dumbledore said. It always was. The last day of term arrived with the cheerful, disorganized energy of 500 students simultaneously packing everything they own while also trying to say goodbye to people they won't see for 2 months, which is a complicated operation even without the emotional component. Gryffindor had won the House Cup, the points adjustments that had been made for the events of the previous week had tipped the balance from Slytherin, producing the specific, theatrical outrage from the Slytherin table that Harry had watched with something between amusement and patience. He didn't particularly care about the House Cup except as a metric of something else, and the something else it measured was a year in which he and the people he'd come to trust had done real work and the work had mattered. That was worth marking. The feast was loud and warm and full of the specific excess of a school that knew how to celebrate. Fred and George had produced, from somewhere, a quantity of enchanted streamers that spelled out rude messages when they caught the light, which McGonagall pretended not to see with impressive conviction. Neville had Trevor in his breast pocket and kept checking on him with the resigned affection of someone who has accepted the relationship. Hermione was compiling a reading list for the summer on a napkin, which Ron periodically tried to remove and which she periodically took back without looking up. Dumbledore stood at the end of the feast and addressed the school with the warmth and authority that 700 years of institutional magic and 4 decades of personal presence had built into the specific frequency of that room. And Harry listened and thought about what it meant to be in a room with someone who was simultaneously a person you'd come to understand in a particular and complicated way and also the thing they appeared to be from the outside, both things real, both things true. He thought about the year. He thought about the Sorting Hat saying this isn't about finding where you belong, it's about choosing. He thought about Ollivander's face when the wand warmed in his hand. He thought about Snape's dungeon office and the specific, unguarded look of a man confronting something that didn't fit. He thought about the mirror showing him himself, whole, fire-eyed, already enough, when the design of the mirror was to show people what they were not. He thought about 73 charms burned away by a phoenix acting on its own nature on a November night in 1981, in a room with a broken window and rain coming in and a 15-month-old child looking at something ancient that recognized him and chose him and asked nothing in return except to be met in kind. He thought about Fawkes, who was not in the Great Hall because Fawkes did not attend school feasts, but whose warmth was present anyway, the way it was always present, constant, unwavering, the most reliable thing there was. After the feast, walking back to Gryffindor Tower for the last time this year, Harry stopped at a window on the 2nd floor and looked out at the grounds. The sun was going down over the forest, turning the sky the specific combination of gold and red that was, he'd always thought, more beautiful than any other color sequence the sky produced. Below, students were on the lawns saying the things you say at the end of term. The lake held the gold of the sunset like something it had been asked to look after. Hermione stopped beside him. After a moment, Ron did too, leaning against the wall on the other side, with Neville behind them. They stood there in the window looking at the evening grounds and nobody said anything for a while, which was its own kind of conversation, the kind that says, "This was real, we are here, the year happened. We're coming back," Ron said eventually. Not a question. "Yes," Harry said. "It'll be different," Hermione said. "Different how?" Neville said. "Different because we know more," Hermione said. "And because the things we don't know yet will be different things. The not knowing will be more specific." She paused. "Which is better?" "Marginally more terrifying but better," Ron said. "Yes," Hermione agreed. Harry looked at the sunset and thought about what was coming, not with dread, not with the anxious urgency that the prophecy could produce in people who held it as a weight rather than a fact. He thought about it the way he thought about everything, clearly, directly, with the specific quality of attention that had been his since the first night, since the fire had run through the bond and burned away everything that wasn't essential and left what was. He was 11 years old and somewhere in the world the fragment of something that had once been a person and had made itself something else was finding a new place to gather itself, and there were years between now and the moment when that became the central problem again, and those years were his. Not the prophecies. His. He thought about flying, and about the chess problem he and Ron had been turning over all week, and about the book Hermione had added to his summer list and the note she'd tucked into his bag that morning, and about the letter he was going to write to the Weasleys about treacle tart, and about whether Neville would be able to keep Trevor over the summer or whether Trevor had a specific and irresistible pull toward the school grounds. He thought about Dumbledore, and Snape, and the long careful work of building something honest in the space where management had been. About the conversations that were still ahead of them, the things still to be said, the errors still to be made and acknowledged and absorbed into the ongoing project of two people who had gotten off on the wrong foot and were actively, honestly trying to build something better. He thought about his parents, James's cloak in his trunk, Lily's eyes in the mirror. About the specific grief of never having had the chance to know them, which he'd held since the first time he understood what had happened, and which had never resolved and never would but which he'd learned to carry the way you carry anything that doesn't go away, not ignoring it, not being consumed by it, just having it, the way you have a scar. On the grounds below, someone launched a small cascade of sparks from their wand, probably Fred or George, and they burst against the evening sky in gold and red, trailing down over the lawn and reflecting off the lake's surface in quick, scattered points. Gold and red. Harry watched the sparks fall. Beside him, Fawkes's warmth brightened, not the urgent flare of the chambers, not the burning away quality of his fire when it was doing work, but something quieter and more basic than either of those. The warmth of something that is simply, fully present. The warmth of something that chose you and means it and has never once, in 11 years, had reason to reconsider. Harry held it. Let it be what it was. Come on, he said, to the 3 people beside him. Let's go pack. They turned from the window together and went down the corridor toward Gryffindor Tower, and their footsteps on the old stone were 4 different rhythms that had been finding their way toward each other all year and had, by now, arrived at something that moved comfortably together, not identical, not synchronized, just easy. The way things are easy when they've been given enough time and honesty to become what they actually are. Behind them, the sun went fully below the horizon and the sky held the last of it, burning, gold and red, the way a fire holds the shape of what it has consumed even after the consuming is done. The castle breathed around them, old and present and full of the accumulated weight of everything that had happened in it and everything that would. The year was over. What came next was theirs.